8 o'clock struck, and the gas jets hissed, a whisper left over from the night watchman's rounds that clung to the throat like unspoken grief. Silas Thorne stepped across the threshold of the public record office in Chancery Lane, his boots striking the flagstones with a damp thud that vanished instantly into the heavy air. Rows of iron shelves lined the corridor, black and rigid as prison bars, casting a yellow pallor from the overhead burners onto dust motes dancing in the stale warmth. It smelled of dry rot here. A sweet perfume of decay settled deep into the fibers of his wool coat over a decade of service, mingling with the sharp, metallic tang of iron gall ink. He moved past the porter's lodge without a nod, invisible, because he carried a weight that rendered him so, his mind fixed not on the ledger waiting at his station, but on the date carved into his brother Aris's headstone 3 years prior. The alcove awaited him, a cramped recess shielded by a partition of stained wood where shadows pooled thick enough to hide a sin. Thorne did not light his own lamp. He preferred the ambient glow from the main corridor, that failing yellow light where boundaries between the present and the past grew thin, permeable as old parchment. From the bin marked Tudor Miscellany, he pulled a bundle of vellum rolls scheduled for recataloguing before the winter session, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the parched surface. A shock of cold traveled up his arm, sharp and sudden, though the room held the stifling heat of 100 closed windows. It was not the temperature of the office, but the memory of arsenic powder scattered on Aris's study floor in 1859 that froze the blood in his veins. He unrolled the specific indictment. Richard Roose, 1531. The handwriting jagged, hurried, the ink faded to the color of dried blood, and as Thorne traced the letters spelling out the names Alice Trippitt and Burnett Curwen, a sudden tightening seized his throat, as if the porridge described in the margin had turned to stone within his own gullet. The charge read willful murder by poison, citing the Poisons Act, 22 Henry VAI C9, mandating a sentence of boiling alive, and the clinical precision of the legalese struck him as a violence in itself, a bureaucratic erasure of the agony contained within the words. Quill in hand, intending only a standard notation regarding the condition of the vellum, he found instead that his hand had moved of its own accord, scratching the word "why" into the margin, a breach of protocol so severe that he immediately dipped the pen in ink to obscure the rebellion, yet the indentation remained, a physical scar on the document mirroring the one on his psyche. The hiss of the gas, jet above, intensified, sounding like the whisper of a man begging for mercy, and Thorne looked up to see shadows lengthening across the floor, though the sun had barely risen over the rooftops of London. "Those rolls are for preservation, Mr. Thorne, not for interrogation." Silas Vane stood at the entrance of the alcove, appearing without warning, his presence announced by the cloying combination of lavender water and stale tobacco that signaled authority and disapproval in equal measure. The chief clerk did not speak immediately, but watched Thorne's hand hovering over the indictment, eyes narrowing as he noted the tremor in the clerk's fingers and the unauthorized proximity of the quill to the state record. "The Tudor rolls are not for annotation," Vane said, his voice dry as the paper itself, "merely for preservation. Any speculation regarding the intent of the accused is contrary to the mission of this office, which is to catalogue the law as it stands, not to mourn the dead." Thorne swallowed, the stone in his throat grinding down. "The law itself demands a reckoning with the intent, sir. There is a distinction between murder and mistake in the common law." Vane cut him off with a sharp gesture, a slicing motion of the hand that brooked no argument. "The Poisons Act was specific and brutal by design, Mr. Thorne, intended to terrify rather than to discern truth. Henry VAI did not craft that statute for the comfort of clerks with troubled consciences." He stepped closer, the smell of lavender overwhelming the scent of ink. "The autumn sessions approach. The office requires full diligence. Your recent absenteeism and distracted manner have been noted and will not be tolerated if the work is to be completed by the end of October." Vane turned on his heel and left, his footsteps fading into the scratching of quills from the other clerks, a sound like insects feeding on wood. Left alone in the deepening gloom of the alcove, Thorne wrapped the indictment back in its protective cloth, but he did not return it to the bin. Instead, he slid it into the inner pocket of his coat, feeling the weight of it against his ribs like a second heart beating a slower, darker rhythm. He reached up and extinguished the gas jet in the corridor, plunging his workspace into a twilight that felt more honest than the artificial glare, and he sat for a long moment listening. He thought of Aris, of the blue tint to his lips in the coffin, and he whispered a promise to the parchment that he would find the voice that was silenced 300 years prior, even if it cost him his position and his sanity. Thorne arose, locking the drawer with a key he kept on a chain around his neck, and as he stepped out into the Chancery Lane fog, the city seemed to tilt slightly, the pavement remembering footsteps that had turned to dust long before the gas lamps were ever lit. The pavement remembering footsteps that had turned to dust before gas lamps were ever lit. Fog, thick, yellow soup clinging to the throat. Thorne pulled his coat tight, the stolen vellum pressing against his ribs like a bruise that would not fade, and stepped off the curb into the churning river of Chancery Lane. Carriages rumbled past, iron rims grinding on stone, splashing mud onto his trousers with a careless violence that mirrored the statute he now carried. He did not flinch, nor did he brush the stain away, for the dirt felt like a necessary penance, a physical mark of the transgression hidden beneath the wool. The world outside, the record office, moved with a speed that seemed obscene, a frantic commerce of men buying and selling, while 300 years ago a cook named Richard Roose had been lowered into a cauldron, his skin blistering as the water below reached its first terrible simmer. "Watch it, mate." A carter cracked his whip, the sound sharp as a bone breaking, and Thorne stumbled sideways, his shoulder colliding with the rough brick of a warehouse wall. Dust coated his tongue. He muttered an apology that died in the fog, his hand instinctively moving to the inner pocket, checking the presence of the indictment through the fabric, a nervous tick he could not suppress. The weight there was heavier than paper should be, dense with the gravity of the boiling sentence, pulling him off balance as he navigated the crowd. He needed air that did not smell of iron gall ink. Turning away from the main thoroughfare, Thorne ducked into a narrow alleyway that ran parallel to the lane, a slit between buildings where the shadows lingered even at midday, and the scent of roasting chestnuts fought a losing battle against the sulphur of the river. Here, the noise of the city dampened to a low thrum, allowing the voices in his head to rise, clearer and more insistent. He saw Alice Trippitt not as a name on a roll, but as a woman with chapped hands, lifting a spoon to her lips, trusting the man who had stirred the pot, unaware that the white powder mixed into the gruel was not salt, but a death warrant signed by a king who feared poison more than the sword. "Why?" The word he had scratched into the margin burned behind his eyes. It was not a legal question. The law was clear. Willful murder by poison demanded the boiler. Henry VII had seen to that, crafting a punishment so grotesque it would curdle the blood of any servant thinking to slip arsenic into a bishop's broth. The statute existed to terrify. Vane was right about that at least, but terror did not explain the tremor in Roose's hand, nor the specific, intimate cruelty of choosing porridge, the very sustenance of life, as the vehicle for destruction. Thorne stopped, leaning against the damp brickwork, and closed his eyes. The image shifted, the steam rising from the alley's grates transformed into the vapor from the great pot at the bishop's palace in Lambeth. He could hear the liquid bubbling, a thick glugging sound that echoed the rhythm of his own pulse. In 1859, Aris had not been boiled. Aris had wasted, his body turning against itself as the arsenic ate him from the inside, a slow, quiet unraveling that left no mark on the law, but a hole in the world that no amount of cataloguing could fill. There had been no indictment for Aris's death, only a coroner's verdict of misadventure, and a silence so profound it had nearly drowned Thorne. "Got a match, Gov?" Thorne jerked upright, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the stolen document. A boy stood in the mouth of the alley, cap pulled low, face smeared with soot, holding out a trembling hand. The child's eyes were wide, fixed not on Thorne's face, but on the bulge in his coat where the vellum lay hidden. "No," Thorne said, his voice rough, unused. "Move along." "Seen you before," the boy muttered, not retreating, shifting his weight from one foot to the other with the restless energy of the street. "Record office bloke, you look like you've seen a ghost, you do." "Go on," Thorne stepped forward, imposing his height, the authority of the clerk masking the panic beneath. "There is nothing for you here." The boy shrugged, a fluid, indifferent motion, and melted back into the fog as quickly as he had appeared, leaving Thorne alone with the sensation of being watched by something far older than a street urchin. He exhaled, the breath pluming white in the chill air, and forced his legs to move again. The destination formed in his mind without conscious choice: Lambeth. The riverside pavement where the bishop's palace once stood, where the earth still held the memory of the kitchen, the pot, and the two souls who had died so that the law might make its point. He walked faster, the cobblestones uneven under his boots, each step a countdown. 42 days until the anniversary of the repeal. 42 days to find the truth buried beneath the legalese, to understand if Roose was a monster or a mistake, to reconcile the boiling water of 1531 with the cold arsenic of 1859. If he failed, the voices would remain silent, trapped in the Vellum, and Arras would never rest. A hansom cab rattled past, the driver shouting for clearance, and Thorne pressed himself into a doorway, the rough wood scraping his cheek. He waited for it to pass, then crossed the street, heading south towards the bridge, towards the river that flowed past the site of the execution, black and indifferent, carrying the secrets of the city out to sea. The wind picked up, carrying the brackish tang of the Thames, a smell of mud and decay that promised no mercy, only the cold, hard facts of the tide. He touched the pocket again. The paper was warm now, heated by his body, alive. "Wait for me," he whispered to the empty air, though he did not know who he was addressing: the dead cook, the dead brother, or the man he was becoming with every step away from the safety of the archives. The fog thickened, swallowing the spire of a distant church, and Thorne walked on, a solitary figure moving through the grey twilight, carrying the weight of a boiling sentence into the heart of the modern city. The brackish scent of the Thames hit him before the river came into view, a thick odor of mud and industrial runoff that coated the tongue like old copper. Thorne climbed the embankment steps, his boots slipping on the wet stone, until the black water lay spread before him, sluggish and heavy under the low clouds. Here, the fog did not behave like the dry mist of Chancery Lane. It clung to the surface of the water, rolling in damp sheets that obscured the opposite bank completely. He stood still, letting the cold seep through the soles of his boots, searching for the exact spot where the bishop's kitchen must have stood 3 centuries prior. There were no markers, no plaques commemorating the boiling of Richard Roose, just the indifferent flow of the tide and the distant chug of a steam tug pulling a barge loaded with coal. A figure emerged from the gloom to his left, a watchman wrapped in an oilskin coat, carrying a lantern that cast a weak circle of light on the mud. "Lost, sir." Thorne turned, his hand instinctively covering the pocket where the vellum lay. "No. Most folks don't come down this way after dark. Too much thieves, too much smell." The watchman spat into the water, the globule vanishing without a sound. "You looking for the palace?" "I know where it was." The watchman chuckled, a dry, rattling noise. That's the word. Nothing stays here. The river takes it all eventually. Bricks, bones, secrets." He stepped closer, the lantern light catching the grey stubble on his chin. "You look like a clerk. Got the ink on your fingers." Thorne rubbed his thumb against his forefinger, trying to obscure the stain. "I work with documents. Paper don't last down here, for damp gets in and rots the fibers." As the watchman shifted his weight, the lantern swung slightly. "My grandfather told me about the boiling, saying the ground shook when they lit the fire under the pot. He said the screams carried over the water to Southwark." "Your grandfather was mistaken. The act was precise. The suffering was contained." "Was it?" The watchman tilted his head, eyes narrowing in the dim light. "Pain don't stay contained, sir. It leaks, like sewage, like arsenic." Thorne flinched, the word striking him with physical force. He stepped back, his heel catching on a loose stone, and steadied himself against the damp railing. The watchman watched him, unblinking, as if waiting for a confession that would not come. "I am not here for ghosts," Thorne said, his voice tighter than he intended. "Everyone is here for ghosts, just won't admit it." As the watchman turned away, he lifted the lantern higher. "Mind the tide, for it comes up fast and drowns the unwary quicker than any poison." He walked off into the fog, the light diminishing until it was nothing more than a faint yellow eye blinking in the dark. Thorne was alone again with the river and the weight in his pocket. He moved closer to the water's edge, the mud squelching under his boots, and crouched down. The ground was cold, frozen hard in patches, but beneath the surface, he imagined he could feel the residual heat of a fire long extinguished. He thought of Aris, lying in the quiet room in Kensington, the sheets pulled up to his chin, the blue lips silent. Aris had not screamed. Aris had faded. But Richard Roose had been subjected to the law's theatre, a public spectacle designed to warn others against the intimate violence of the kitchen. Thorne placed his bare hand on the mud. It was freezing. He pressed harder until the cold bit into his palm, searching for a warmth that existed only in his mind. The statute said boiling alive. It did not specify the temperature of the water, nor the duration of the agony, nor the specific moment when the soul departed the body. These details were left to the executioner, to the efficiency of the fire, to the mercy of a crowd that bayed for blood. Henry VIAI had wanted terror. He had achieved it, but terror was not truth. Thorne stood up, wiping the mud on his trousers, leaving a dark smear across the wool. He looked out over the water, where the fog seemed to coalesce into shapes, human forms rising from the silt before dissolving back into the grey. Alice Trippitt, Bernard Curwen, names on a roll, now voices in the mist. He had come to find the site, to anchor the horror in a physical location, but the river offered no solidarity. It only offered the tide. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the indictment, the vellum soft and pliable from the heat of his body. He unfolded it there by the water's edge, the wind threatening to tear the fragile document from his grasp. The ink swam before his eyes, the letters jagged and urgent. Willful murder, poison's act, boiling. Why, he whispered again, the words snatched away by the wind. There was no answer from the water, no answer from the empty pavement where the kitchen once stood, only the lap of the tide against the mud, a rhythmic sucking sound that mirrored the glugging of a pot coming to the boil. Thorne folded the document quickly, shoving it back into his pocket before the damp could ruin it. He turned away from the river, his face set against the wind, and began the walk back towards the bridge. He had found the place. Now he had to find the reason. A clock tower chimed in the distance, the sound muffled by the fog, 9 strokes. He had been gone an hour. Vane would expect him back at the office by 10 for the evening ledger, a routine check that had become a trap since the chief clerk began suspecting his irregularities. Thorne quickened his pace, the mud releasing his boots with a wet slap, each step pulling him deeper into the conspiracy of the past. He could not solve this by the river. The answer lay in the margins, in the gaps between the legal phrases, in the silence that the law had enforced for 300 years. He reached the road, the gas lamps here burning brighter, casting long shadows that stretched towards him like grasping fingers. A hansom cab passed, the wheels splashing through a puddle, spraying dirty water onto the hem of his coat. He did not flinch. He walked on, the weight of the indictment against his ribs now a constant pressure, a reminder that the dead were not done with him. The fog thickened as he approached the bridge, swallowing the lamps one by one, until he was walking in a tunnel of grey light, moving between the present and the past, with no clear boundary to mark the transition. He stopped at the center of the bridge, leaning over the parapet to look down at the black water flowing beneath. It moved swiftly here, churned by the pilings, carrying the debris of the city towards the sea. He watched a piece of wood float past, bobbing in the wake of a barge, and wondered if it had once been part of a spoon, a bowl, or the handle of a ladle used to stir the fatal gruel. The thought was absurd. Wood rotted, metal rusted. Only the law remained, etched in statute and memory, demanding its due. Thorne pushed away from the parapet and continued walking. The office waited, the ledger waited, but the truth was out here, in the cold and the mud, and he would not rest until he had dragged it into the light. He touched his pocket one last time, ensuring the document was secure, and stepped into the flow of pedestrians heading home, a solitary man carrying a secret that burned hotter than any fire. The iron gates of Chancery Lane stood open, a black mouth waiting to swallow him whole. Thorne passed through, the wet hem of his coat dragging heavy against his ankles, leaving a trail of river mud on the clean flagstones of the entrance hall. He paused there, just inside the threshold, letting the warmth of the building seep into his bones, while the fog curled around the doorframe behind him like a living thing refusing to let go. The air inside tasted of dust and old paper, a dry contrast to the brackish damp still clinging to his skin. He brushed at his sleeves, trying to dislodge the smell of the Thames, but the scent of mud was stubborn, rooted in the weave of the wool. Silas Vane stood at the top of the stairs. He did not move, merely watched Thorne approach with the stillness of a predator that has already calculated the kill. The gas jets behind him hissed, casting his face in sharp relief, highlighting the deep lines around his mouth that spoke of decades spent squinting at faded script. Thorne climbed the steps, his boots making a wet slap against the stone that echoed too loudly in the quiet hall. He wanted to reach his alcove, to lock the door, to pull the indictment from his pocket and spread it on the desk where the shadows could hide the tremor in his hands. Vane stepped down, blocking the path. "You are late," Vane said. His voice was flat, devoid of curiosity, stating a fact rather than asking a question. "The fog," Thorne replied. He kept his hands in his pockets, fingers curled around the vellum roll. "It obscures the path along the embankment. The fog has been thick all week, yet it does not prevent others from keeping time." Vane extended a hand, palm up. "The ledger." Thorne hesitated. To give over the ledger now meant opening his coat, and the movement might reveal the bulge in his waistcoat where the indictment lay hidden against his side. He could feel the edge of the vellum pressing into his hip, a hard ridge beneath the fabric. If Vane saw it, if he asked to see what document warranted such secrecy, the inquiry would end before it began. Dismissal would be the least of his worries. The Crown took a dim view of clerks who removed original indictments from the archives without warrant. He drew the leather-bound book from his inner pocket, keeping his coat closed tight, and placed it in Vane's hand. "The evening entries are incomplete," Vane said, opening the book to the current page. He ran a finger down the column of dates, stopping at the current day. "You have logged the Tudor miscellany, but the condition report is blank." "I was interrupted," Thorne said. "The light failed." "Gas does not fail unless the supply is cut. The jets were lit at 4. Vane looked up, his eyes narrow. "You look unwell, Thorne. You have the pallor of a man who has seen a ghost." "Only the dust," Thorne said. He shifted his weight, trying to angle his body away from the chief clerk. "It gets into the lungs." Vane snapped the ledger shut. The sound cracked through the hall like a pistol shot. He held the book out, not releasing it, until Thorne was forced to grip the cover. "See that the report is completed by morning. The winter session begins in 3 weeks. I will not have gaps in the record because you prefer wandering the streets to your duties." "It will be done." "Ensure it is." Vane turned on his heel, his coat tails swirling around his legs. "And Thorne, do not think I do not notice when the bins are lighter than they should be." He walked away, disappearing into the corridor that led to the private offices, leaving Thorne standing alone under the hiss of the gaslight. Thorne waited until the sound of Vane's footsteps faded completely before he moved. His heart hammered against his sternum, a frantic rhythm that made his breath catch in his throat. He walked quickly to his alcove, shutting the wooden partition door behind him and sliding the bolt home. The small space smelled of ink and the stale tobacco smoke he sometimes burned to mask the scent of decay. He lit a single candle, shielding the flame with his hand, and sat at the desk. The indictment came out of his pocket like a secret confession. He laid it on the wood, smoothing the curls of the vellum with palms that were still cold from the river. The ink looked darker here, under the steady glow of the candle, the letters sharp and accusing. Richard Roose, Alice Trippitt, Bernard Curwen, 3 names that had ended in a pot of boiling water, their lives reduced to a legal precedent that still held weight 300 years later. Thorne dipped his quill into the inkwell, the nib hovering over the margin where he had written "Y" in the office earlier. He could not leave it there. Vane would see it during the morning inspection. He reached for the sand shaker to blot the word out, but stopped. To erase it was to admit guilt. To leave it was to invite discovery. He blew out the candle. Darkness flooded the alcove, thick and absolute. In the blackness, the sounds of the office changed. The hiss of the gas jets in the corridor became a whisper, like steam escaping a valve. He could hear the scratching of other clerks working late in the main hall, the sound of nibs tearing into paper, 100 small cuts being made in the skin of the history they preserved. Thorne leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He thought of Aris, lying in the ground at Highgate, the arsenic doing its work slowly, turning the blood to poison while the doctors argued over symptoms. He had not been there to stop it. He had been here, cataloguing the deaths of strangers while his own brother choked on his own breath. The indictment lay on the desk, invisible in the dark. He reached out and touched it again, his fingers tracing the edge of the parchment. It felt warm, as if it had absorbed the heat of his body during the walk from Lambeth. There was a mistake in the record. He felt it in the way the words sat on the page, too hurried, too eager to condemn. Henry VII had wanted an example, a display of power to frighten the households of bishops who grew too bold. Roose was the sacrifice. But the margin notes spoke of a white powder found in the pantry, not mixed in the pot. A jest, the clerk had written, a mistake. Thorne struck a match. The sulphur flare illuminated his face for a second, casting deep shadows into the hollows of his cheeks. He relit the candle and picked up the quill. He would not erase the Y, he would add to it. He dipped the pen and wrote beneath the word, in a script so small it required a magnifying glass to read, not willful, accident. A floorboard creaked outside the partition. Thorne froze, the quill poised above the vellum. The sound was deliberate, a weight shifting intentionally near his door. He blew out the candle again, plunging the alcove back into darkness. He sat perfectly still, listening to the breathing of the building, waiting to see if the handle would turn. The wood remained still. The shadow under the door did not change. Whoever stood there was waiting for him to make a mistake, to light the lamp again, to reveal his position in the dark. Thorne slid the indictment into the drawer of his desk, locking it with the small key he kept on a chain around his neck. He placed his hands on the surface of the wood, feeling the vibration of the building settle around him. They knew. He did not know how or who, but the certainty sat in his gut like a stone. Vane's warning about the bins had not been about dust. It was about weight, about documents that left the building and returned lighter than before. Thorne leaned forward, resting his forehead against the cool wood of the desk. He had 42 days until the anniversary of the Act's repeal. He had to finish the marginalia before they took the rolls away for the winter storage. He lifted his head, staring into the dark where the eyes of the dead seemed to watch him from the corners of the room. "Wait," he whispered to the shadows, "give me time." The floorboard creaked again, closer this time. Thorne stood up, pushing the chair back with a scrape that sounded like a scream in the silence. He walked to the door and threw the bolt open, stepping out into the corridor where the gaslight burned bright and cruel. The hallway was empty. No one stood there, no one waited, but the air felt disturbed, shifted by a presence that had just slipped away. He walked towards the main hall, his steps heavy, the key burning against his chest. The ledger lay on Vane's desk upstairs, incomplete. The indictment lay in his drawer, compromised. He had chosen his side, and now the office itself seemed to turn against him, the rows of iron shelves looming like cages in the yellow light. He reached the main floor and picked up his hat. He would not finish the ledger tonight. Let Vane find the blank page, let him wonder. Thorne pushed open the front doors and stepped back into the fog, leaving the safety of the archive for the chaos of the street. The cold hit him immediately, biting through his coat, but he welcomed it. It was honest. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. He turned towards Highgate, towards the grave where his brother lay. If he was to be hunted for the truth, he would need to know exactly what kind of poison had killed Aris, and whether the bottle had truly been found empty or merely placed that way. The gas lamps flickered as he walked, dying one by one as the wind picked up. He pulled his collar up, hiding his face from the few passers-by who hurried through the gloom. Behind him, the public record office loomed, a fortress of paper and law that guarded its secrets with the ferocity of a dragon. Thorne did not look back. He walked into the dark, carrying the key to the drawer like a weapon, ready to unlock the past before it buried him alive. Mud sucked at the soles of his boots, a wet, clinging greed that threatened to pull the leather from the stitching with every stride. Thorne kept his head down, collar turned up against the biting wind that swept down from the hills, carrying the scent of coal smoke and unburnt carbon that tasted of copper on the tongue. London at night was not the city of commerce and law he navigated by day. It was a creature of shadows and recesses, where the gas jets struggled against the fog and failed, leaving pools of darkness between the islands of yellow light. He walked fast, arms pinned to his sides, the key on the chain against his chest, tapping a rhythmic warning against his sternum with each step. Tab, tab, tab. Aris had worn a similar chain, though his held a seal for wax, not a key for iron. The memory surfaced unbidden, sharp as a splinter under the fingernail. Thorne pushed it down, focusing instead on the pavement, the uneven stones slick with rain and something darker, something oily that reflected the gaslight in fractured shards. He needed to know. The indictment of Richard Roose spoke of willful murder, of a cook who sought to destroy a bishop's household, but the margin notes whispered of a jest, a powder misplaced. Aris's death had been ruled accidental, a bottle of laudanum mistaken for medicine, yet the bottle had been found empty on the floor, cap loose, while Aris lay composed upon the bed. Too composed. A hansom cab rattled past, the horse's hooves striking sparks from the stones, the driver invisible beneath a stack of oilskin cloths. Thorne stepped into the gutter to avoid the spray, the cold water soaking instantly through his trousers to the skin. He did not flinch. Pain was a confirmation of existence, a tether to the present when the past threatened to drag him under. He thought of the boiling pot at Smithfield, the steam rising from the flesh of a man condemned by an Act of Parliament, and wondered if Aris had felt heat before the end, or only the cold, creeping silence of the nerves shutting down. Poison was a quiet executioner. It required no scaffold, no crowd, no drumroll. It needed only a pantry, a moment of distraction, and the trust of a brother who believed the study door was locked. He turned onto the road leading towards Highgate, the incline steepening, the air growing thinner and colder as the city sprawl gave way to the cemetery grounds. The iron gate stood ahead, black against the grey sky, topped with spikes that looked like the teeth of a trap. A lantern burned beside the lodge, a single eye watching the road. Thorne slowed his pace, wiping his hands on his coat to dry the sweat that had gathered despite the chill. He could not demand entry as a clerk here. He was merely a mourner, and a late one at that. A figure emerged from the lodge, a man wrapped in a heavy greatcoat, the collar turned up to hide the lower half of his face. He carried a truncheon in one hand, the wood worn smooth by years of grip. "Grounds are closed," the man said. His voice was gravel, roughened by smoke and lack of use. Thorne stopped 3 paces from the gate. "I seek a grave." "Everyone seeks a grave eventually. Tomorrow's the day for seeking." "It cannot wait until morning." The watchman shifted his weight, the lantern light catching the brass buttons of his coat. He looked Thorne up and down, assessing the quality of the wool, the cut of the boots, the desperation in the posture. "Name." "Thorne, Aris Thorne." The watchman did not move. He stood still as the stone pillars flanking the entrance, the lantern smoke drifting up to join the fog. "Visited 2 days past." Thorne felt the blood stop in his veins. "I was not here." "Someone was." The watchman stepped closer, the light swinging slightly with the motion of his arm. "Left a flower, white hellebore, poisonous lot that." "Who?" He didn't give a name, wearing instead a clerk's coat of grey wool stained with ink. The watchman tapped the truncheon against his palm, a soft, rhythmic threat. He said he knew the deceased, claiming he had unfinished business. Thorne's hand went to the key at his chest, fingers curling around the metal until it bit into the skin. Vain, it had to be vain. The chief clerk had followed him from the office, or sent a man to follow, tracing the line of inquiry back to the source. But why the flower? Hellebore was not a symbol of mourning. It was a symbol of madness, of calumny, a message. "Did he speak?" Thorne asked. "Did he say anything else?" "Said the record was wrong." The watchman leaned against the gate, the iron groaning under his weight. "Said the brother didn't drink the bottle, said it was poured." Thorne gripped the gate, the cold iron searing his palms. "Let me in." "Rules are rules." "I have money." "Not for sale." The watchman pushed off the gate, turning back towards the lodge. "Come back at 6, when the sun is up and the locks are oiled." He was murdered. The words tore from Thorne's throat, raw and loud in the quiet street. "And you stand guard over the lie." The watchman paused, his back to Thorne, the lantern casting a long, distorted shadow that stretched across the road to touch Thorne's boots. "I stand guard over the dead, mister. The living look after themselves." He unlocked the side door of the lodge, stepping inside without looking back. 6 o'clock, don't be late. The door slammed shut, the lock clicked. Thorne stood alone in the road where fog swirled around his ankles like living smoke, and the key at his chest felt heavy, a weight dragging him down towards the earth. Someone had been to the grave, someone from the office who knew about Aris and the powder. They were marking the territory by leaving poisonous flowers on the soil to warn him off. He looked up at the spikes atop the gate, thinking of the indictment in his drawer and the margin notes he had written in the dark. Not willful. Accident. But accidents did not leave flowers. He turned away from the gate, walking back down the hill towards the city, the wind at his back now pushing him forward. He would not wait until 6. He would not wait for permission. The office wanted a clerk who catalogued death without questioning it. They wanted a man who filed the indictments and forgot the names. They had chosen the wrong man. Thorne reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook, the pages filled with scribbles and times and dates. He opened it to a fresh page and wrote, Hellebore, Vane. He snapped the book shut and tucked it away. The fog was thickening, obscuring the road ahead, turning the world into a grey void where sound traveled further than sight. He listened for footsteps behind him, for the shift of weight on the pavement, but there was only the wind and the distant rumble of a carriage on the main road. He walked faster, the image of the white flower burning in his mind, petals pale as bone against the dark earth. Aris had not drunk the laudanum. It had been poured. And the man who poured it walked the same corridors as Thorne, breathed the same dust-filled air, and perhaps even now sat at a desk nearby, waiting for Thorne to make a mistake. Thorne touched the key again, ensuring it was still there, still real. He would return at night. He would climb the wall if he had to. He needed to see the earth, to see if the soil had been disturbed, if the flower was truly there or a fabrication of a watchman paid to lie. The truth was not in the ledgers. It was in the ground. He reached the bottom of the hill and turned onto the main road, where the gas lamps burned brighter and the people were more numerous. He blended into the crowd, just another shadow moving through the light, carrying a secret that could burn the office down. Behind him, the cemetery gate stood silent, the lantern beside the lodge extinguished, leaving the entrance to the dead in total darkness. The notebook dug into his thigh, a hard rectangle of leather and paper pressing against the bone every time his leg swung forward. Thorne kept his hand in his pocket, fingers wrapped around the edge, as if holding it too loosely might allow the secrets inside to spill out onto the wet pavement. Carriage wheels clattered on the stones nearby, iron rims striking sparks that died instantly in the damp air. He stepped out from the shadow of the cemetery wall and raised a hand. A hansom cab slowed, the horse snorting steam into the night. The driver leaned down, the collar of his coat turned up against the damp, his face obscured by the brim of a hat that had seen better decades. "Where to, Governor?" "Chancery Lane," Thorne said, "the Public Record Office." "Late for filing," the driver said. He spat on the road, a dark globule that vanished into the grit. "Office closes at 6. Watchmen lock the doors at 7. "I have a key." The driver looked at him then, really looked, eyes catching the glint of the gas lamp on the corner. He saw the ink on Thorne's cuffs, the way the man's shoulders hunched against a cold that wasn't entirely weather. He flicked the reins. "Clamber up then, extra for the weight." 10 minutes, Thorne said. He put a foot on the wheel and hoisted himself into the cab. The seat smelled of wet dog and old tobacco, a scent that lodged in the back of his throat. He sat forward, elbows on knees, watching the road unwind beneath the horse's hooves. The city moved around them, a beast breathing in the dark, shopkeepers pulling down shutters, maids locking scullery doors, the whole of London securing itself against the night while he went to unlock it. Inside his waistcoat, the key rested against his sternum, warm from his body heat. Aris had worn a similar key once, for a desk that now belonged to another clerk. The hellebore on the grave was not a gift. It was a warning painted in petals, madness, calumny. Vane was telling him that to pursue this was to lose his mind, or his reputation, or both. But the watchman had said the record was wrong, said it was poured. "Rough night," the driver called back over his shoulder. The wind took his voice, tearing the words apart. "Fog coming in off the river, you can taste it." "I have work," Thorne said. "Work waits." "Not this work." Cab turned onto High Holborn, the wheels slipping slightly on the slick stones. Thorne gripped the side of the cab, his knuckles white. He thought of Richard Roose, standing in the kitchen at Lambeth in 1531, holding a pot of porridge that weighed more than a man's conscience. The Poisons Act had been written for him, a law tailored to fit a single crime, boiling alive mandated by the king's wrath. Henry VIAI had wanted a punishment that fit the secrecy of the act, a death that mirrored the method. Poison in the body, fire on the outside. Thorne touched the notebook again. Aris had not been boiled. He had been found in his study, mouth foaming, skin blue. The coroner called it an accident. A bottle of laudanum knocked over in a fit of melancholy. But laudanum did not leave white residue on the lips. Arsenic did. And arsenic was not kept in a study unless the man intended to use it or expected it to be used on him. Here, Thorne said, the cab halted before the iron gates of the office. The building loomed, brick upon brick, a fortress of paper and dust. Only one window glowed on the second floor, his window or Vane's. Wait, Thorne said. He dropped a coin into the well. Keep the engine running. Coin covers half an hour, the driver said. He pocketed the silver without counting it. Don't take the whole night. Horse is tired. Thorne slid out of the cab and walked to the gate. He inserted the key, the metal cold against his palm, and turned it. The lock clicked, a sound too loud in the quiet street. He pushed the door open and stepped into the foyer, the smell of dry rot hitting him like a physical blow. It was the scent of time decaying, of wood turning to powder, of ink fading into nothingness. He did not light a lamp. The glow from the street filtered through the frosted glass of the door, casting long, grey shadows across the floor. He climbed the stairs, his boots making no sound on the wood. The handrail was smooth, worn by the hands of 1,000 clerks who had climbed these steps to bury themselves in the past. On the landing, he paused. The light under his office door was not the steady yellow of gas, but the flickering orange of a fire. Someone had lit the grate. Thorne moved to the door and pressed his ear against the wood. He heard the scratch of a pen. Slow, deliberate strokes, not the hurried scrawl of a clerk copying deeds, but the careful writing of a man composing a letter or altering a record. He put his hand on the latch. The metal was warm. "Who is there?" Thorne said. His voice was low, but it carried through the wood. The scratching stopped. A chair scraped against the floorboards. Heavy footsteps approached the door. Thorne stepped back, his hand going to the pocket where the notebook lay. He was not armed. The law did not permit clerks to carry truncheons, let alone pistols. He had only the truth, and the truth was a fragile weapon against a man like Vane. The latch turned, the door opened. Silas Vane stood in the doorway, blocking the light from the fire. He held a candle in one hand, the wax dripping onto his fingers, but he did not flinch at the heat. He wore his coat buttoned to the throat, though the room was warm from the grate. His face was pale, the skin tight over the bone, eyes dark and unreadable in the flickering light. "Thorne," Vane said. He did not sound surprised. "I wondered when you would return." "The grave," Thorne said. "You sent the flower." A gesture of sympathy. Vane stepped back into the room, leaving the door open, an invitation or a trap. Aris was a colleague. We all mourn the loss. Hellebore is not for mourning. Thorne crossed the threshold. The fire crackled in the grate, sending sparks up the chimney. On the desk, the indictment of Richard Roose lay open, the vellum glowing in the candlelight. Beside it sat a small pot of white powder. "Botany is complex," Vane said. He placed the candle on the desk, next to the powder. "Many plants serve multiple purposes, healing, harm. It depends on the hand that administers the dose." "Did you pour it?" Vane looked at him, and for a moment the mask slipped. Thorne saw the exhaustion there, the weight of a man who had spent 30 years burying secrets in the archives. Vane reached out and touched the edge of the indictment. "Richard Roose boiled alive," Vane said. His voice was soft, almost gentle. "Because he poisoned the pot. But what if the pot was already poisoned, Thorne? What if the cook was merely the vessel?" Thorne looked at the white powder. It looked like flour, like snow, like the residue on Aris's lips. "Are you confessing?" Thorne asked. Vane smiled. It was a thin, dry expression that did not reach his eyes. "I am cataloguing. There is a difference." He picked up the pen he had been using and dipped it into the inkwell. Sit down, Silas. We have much to discuss before the sun rises, and the lock on the gate is very sturdy. Thorne looked at the door behind him, then at the powder on the desk. The horse waited outside. The city breathed in the dark. He stepped forward and pulled the chair out from the desk. Talk, Thorne said. Vane dipped the pen. The nib scratched against the paper, a sound like bone on stone. First, Vane said, you must understand the nature of the act. It was not justice, it was theatre. He began to write, the ink flowing dark and wet, and theatre requires an audience, or at least it requires someone to keep the lights burning. Thorne sat. He kept his hand in his pocket, wrapped around the notebook. The fire warmed his legs, but the cold in his chest remained. He watched the pen move, forming letters that could condemn a man or save him. He waited for the next word, the next stroke, the next truth. Vane stopped writing. He looked up, the candlelight casting deep shadows into his sockets. Tell me, Vane said, did the watchman tell you about the flower, or did he tell you about the soil? Thorne tightened his grip on the notebook. The leather creaked. He told me enough, Thorne said. Did he? Vane blew out the candle. The room plunged into darkness, save for the glow of the embers in the grate. Then you know why you cannot leave. Darkness did not fall so much as it rose from the floorboards, a thick, oily substance that swallowed the glow of the embers until only the red eye of the grate remained, pulsing like a dying heart in the chest of the room. Thorne sat rigid, the wood of the chair biting into his thighs, his hand still clenched around the notebook in his pocket, the leather cover digging a sharp square of pain into his palm. He could hear Vane breathing on the other side of the desk, a wet, rattling sound that suggested lungs clogged with the same dust that coated the indictments upstairs. Light, Thorne said. The word dropped flat, useless against the heavy air. The fire suffices, Vane replied, his voice emerging from the shadows near the window, detached and cool. Candles deceive. They flatter the writer and soften the edges of a lie. Ash tells the truth. A spark jumped from the grate, spiraling up the chimney before dying on the hearth rug, leaving a tiny black scar on the wool. Thorne shifted his weight, the friction of his trouser leg sounding deafening in the quiet, and stared at the spot where the white powder sat on the desk, now invisible but present in his mind as a glaring, toxic moon. He thought of Aris, of the way his brother's skin had turned the color of old parchment in the final hours, the veins mapping a blue river system beneath the surface before the silence took him. That silence had been different. It had been full of waiting, of nurses whispering behind doors, of doctors who shook their heads and spoke of bad water or tainted meat, never of hellebore, never of a chief clerk with a garden and a grudge. You speak of theatre, Thorne said, forcing his tongue to shape the vowels clearly, but you keep the script. We all keep scripts, Silas. Some are bound in vellum and stored in Chancery Lane. Others are kept in the soil of a garden in Lambeth. Vane moved, the floorboard creaking under his boot, a sound like a bone snapping in a pot of broth. Richard Roose did not choose his role. Henry VII cast him. The king required a monster to justify a new law, and the cook, poor fool, stepped into the light when the curtain rose. And Alice, Thorne asked, and Bernard Curwen, were they extras, mere props to make the tragedy convincing? They were the price. Vane's voice came closer, drifting through the gloom. In 1531, 2 lives were a small tax to pay for the security of a bishop. In 1862, perhaps 1 life is sufficient to protect the reputation of an office. Thorne stood up. The movement was sudden, violent, knocking the chair back so it scraped harshly against the stone floor, a shriek that tore at the nerves. He could not see Vane, but he could feel the man's presence, a cold pressure against his shins. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the notebook, the paper crackling as he gripped it, his thumb finding the edge of the page where he had written why, in the margin of the past, a question that now seemed directed at the man standing in the dark with him. Show me the ledger, Thorne demanded, the one you were writing in when I arrived, the one you hid when I knocked. It is not a ledger, it is a correction. Of what? The record. A match struck, the sulphur flare brief and blinding, illuminating Vane's face for a fraction of a second before he lit a fresh candle from the embers. The flame wavered, casting long, dancing shadows that made the furniture seem to lean in, hungry and attentive. Vane held the candle low, the light catching the deep lines around his mouth, the grey stubble on his chin, the eyes that looked less like those of a colleague and more like those of a gravedigger who had spent too long underground. He placed the candle back on the desk, next to the small pot of powder, and tapped the rim with a fingernail. Click, click, click. History is not what happened, sealers. It is what we agree to write down. The Poisons Act was not about justice for Alice Trippitt. It was about fear. Henry VII was terrified of being next, so he made an example of the cook. He boiled him alive at Smithfield to show the world that the crown could reach into the kitchen and pull out death by the roots. Thorne stepped forward, the heat from the fire warming his front while his back remained chilled by the draught from the door. He looked at the powder, then at Vane's hand, which rested casually near the pot. "And you, what are you terrified of, sealers?" "Obsolescence." Vane smiled again, that thin, dry stretching of skin, and the messiness of truth. If people knew that Aris did not die of an accidental overdose, that his death was facilitated by a misunderstanding of botanical properties, they would question the coroner, they would question the family, they would question why a senior clerk kept rare toxins in his private study. "You killed him." The words felt heavy, like stones swallowed whole. "I offered him a remedy." Vane's tone sharpened, losing its philosophical edge. "He was in pain. Grief does that to a man. It makes him reckless. He came to me, begging for something to ease the ache of your loss, of his own failures. I gave him what he asked for, a tincture. He misread the dosage. A tragedy, yes, but not a murder." "He was my brother." Thorne's voice cracked, a fissure running through the calm he had tried to maintain. "You do not get to call it a tragedy." "I call it what the record will say." Vane picked up the pen again, dipping it into the ink. The nib glistened, black and sharp. "Unless you intend to change the entry, but to do that you would need proof, and proof, like the powder, is easily scattered." Thorne looked at the open door behind Vane, the sliver of hallway light offering a path to the stairs, to the street, to the Watchman and the horse, and the safety of a world where laws mattered more than interpretations. But the distance seemed vast, a canyon filled with the ghosts of 1531 and the fresh corpse of 1859. He thought of the boiling pot at Smithfield, the steam rising, the screams of Richard Roose lost to the roar of the fire, and realized that the mechanism of justice had not changed in 300 years. It was still a matter of who held the pen and who held the pot. "The flower," Thorne said softly. "Hellebore, you left it on the grave to remind me, or to warn me." "To remind you that some roots run deep," Vane corrected. He began to write, the scratch of the nib loud in the silence, filling the page with neat, looping script that would become the official truth if Thorne walked away now. "Sit down, sealers. Finish the catalogue. Let us ensure the archive is complete before the morning shift arrives. We wouldn't want them to find discrepancies." Thorne remained standing, his muscles coiled, the notebook heavy in his hand. The candle flame flickered as a draft swept through the room, bending the light towards the powder pot, towards the indictment, towards the man who had decided that grief was a clerical error to be corrected. He looked at Vane's hand, steady on the pen, and then at his own, trembling slightly, stained with the ink of 1,000 documents that told other people's lies. "If I sit," Thorne said, his voice low, rough with the threat of violence he had never before entertained, "you will tell me where the rest of the hellebore is kept." Vane paused, the pen hovering above the paper, a single drop of ink swelling at the tip, ready to fall and ruin the page. He looked up, and in the candlelight, his eyes were devoid of pity, devoid of fear, filled only with the cold calculation of a man who had already balanced the books. "Sit," Vane said, "and we shall see." The drop of ink fell, hitting the vellum with a soft, wet slap, spreading like a bruise across the white surface, a dark stain that no amount of scraping could ever fully remove. Thorne watched it spread, knowing that whatever choice he made next would leave a mark just as permanent, just as impossible to erase. He pulled the chair forward, the legs screeching against the stone, and sat down in the circle of light, close enough to touch the powder, close enough to strike. "Begin," Thorne said. Vane smiled and pushed the pot of white powder across the desk, sliding it until it rested directly between them, a silent arbiter in the trial of the living. The powder sat between them, a small white hill on the dark mahogany, catching the candlelight and throwing it back in a dull, chalky gleam. Thorne stared at it, He could smell the dust, dry and earthy, nothing like the sweet rot of the hellebore root he had seen on the grave, yet it carried the same weight of finality. His hand hovered over the ledger, the quill feeling clumsy, a blunt instrument compared to the precision of the poison. "Right," Vane said. Thorne dipped the nib. The ink bloomed black against the cream paper, the letters forming slowly, each stroke a deliberate act of surrender. Item, indictment of Richard Roose, cook. The words looked innocent enough, sterile bureaucratic markers that hid the screaming meat beneath. He wrote the date, 1531, and felt the year press against his temples, a physical pressure behind the eyes. "The dosage," Thorne said, not looking up. "For Aris, was it hellebore alone?" Vane leaned back, the wood of his chair creaking under the shift in weight. He watched Thorne's hand, tracking the movement of the quill as one might watch a clock tick down to an explosion. "Hellebore reveals the heart's weakness. It does not create the flaw. Your brother carried the flaw. I merely provided the key." "You provided the lock." Thorne's voice was flat, stripped of the tremor that had shaken it moments before. He pressed harder, the nib digging a furrow into the page. "And Richard Roose, did he carry a flaw, or did Henry VIAI provide the lock for him too?" "History is a kitchen," Vane said, waving a hand towards the window where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. "Some men stir the pot, others are the ingredients. Roose stirred, he failed. The king decided the penalty. The law is just the recipe." Thorne stopped writing. The ink pooled at the end of the last word, a dark tear waiting to fall. He looked at the powder again, thinking of the porridge in the bishop's hall, the white grit mixed into the gruel, the mistake or the malice that had turned a meal into a massacre. Alice Trippitt and Bernard Curwen had eaten it without knowing. They had trusted the cook. Trust was the first ingredient always. "Aris trusted you," Thorne said. Aris trusted anyone who offered him silence. Vane's face hardened, the mask of the scholar slipping to reveal the bureaucrat beneath, cold and efficient. "He came to me weeping, Silas, weeping for you, for his own inadequacy, for the world that moved on while he stayed stuck in the mud of your grief. He wanted to forget. I gave him the forgetfulness. That he took too much is a matter of arithmetic, not morality." "Murder is arithmetic," Thorne said. "One life subtracted, one story ended." "Semantics." Vane tapped the desk, his finger landing inches from the powder pot. "Finish the entry, note the condition of the vellum, note the seal, do not note the truth. The truth is not catalogued here." Thorne resumed writing, but his hand shook now, a fine vibration that traveled up the quill and into his wrist. The letters wavered, losing their uniformity, becoming jagged and urgent. He wrote about the boil, the sentence mandated by the act, the specific horror of being lowered into the water while still alive. The description felt inadequate, the words too clean, too dry to capture the steam, the smell of cooking flesh, the sound of a man boiling alive in the square at Smithfield. "Why keep the powder?" Thorne asked, the question slipping out before he could check it. "If it is just arithmetic, why keep the variable?" Vane smiled, a thin stretching of lips that did not reach his eyes. "Because variables are useful, because sometimes the record needs correcting, because you are sitting here, writing lies, instead of raising the alarm." Thorne looked at the door again. The sliver of light from the hallway seemed narrower now, as if the building itself was closing in, squeezing the air from the room. He thought of the watchman downstairs, the horse stamping in the cold, the normalcy of a London night where men went home to wives and warm fires, unaware that in this room, history was being rewritten in real time. He thought of Aris, alone in his study, the cup in his hand, the sudden cramp, the realization that the remedy was the disease. "The rest of the hellebore," Thorne said, "where is it?" Vane watched him, silent for a long moment, the only sound the scratching of the quill and the distant hiss of the gas jets in the corridor. He reached into his coat pocket, a slow, deliberate movement, and withdrew a small packet wrapped in brown paper. He placed it on the desk, next to the powder pot, completing the triangle of evidence that could hang them both or save them neither. "In the cellar," Vane said, "with the other refuse, alongside the records we do not keep." "You keep everything," Thorne said. "That is your sin. You hoard the truth until it rots." "I preserve order," Vane corrected. "Chaos is the alternative. Chaos is a world where cooks poison bishops and clerks kill their brothers and no one writes it down because the ink runs out. I ensure the ink holds. Thorne looked at the packet, then at the ledger, then at Vane. The candle flame guttered, casting long, dancing shadows that made Vane's face seem to shift, to age and rejuvenate in the same breath. He felt a sudden, overwhelming fatigue, a heaviness in his bones that had nothing to do with the hour and everything to do with the weight of the dead pressing down on him. He wanted to sweep the desk clear, to scatter the powder, to tear the ledger apart and feed it to the fire. But he did not move. He sat frozen, the quill still in his hand, the ink drying on the nib. "What happens now?" Thorne asked. "Now," Vane picked up his own pen, dipping it once more. "Now we finish the work. The morning shift arrives in 2 hours. We ensure the catalogue is complete. We lock the door. And you go home to your empty house, and I go to mine, and we pretend that nothing has changed." "Nothing has changed," Thorne repeated, the words tasting of ash. "Exactly." Vane began to write again, the scratch of the nib filling the silence, a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that seemed to measure out the remaining seconds of the night. "The past is dead. The record is alive. That is all that matters." Thorne looked down at the page. The ink had dried, the words fixed and immutable. "Richard Roose, boiled alive." He added a final note, a small, insignificant mark in the margin that no one would notice, a tiny deviation in the perfect line of the script, a dot, a period, a full stop that felt like a bullet. He put the quill down. The silence returned, heavier than before, pressing against his ears, filling his lungs. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the street, the houses, the city, leaving only this room, this desk, this man, and the white powder that waited, patient and indifferent, for the next mistake to be made. Thorne reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the brown packet, the paper rough against his skin. He did not pick it up, not yet. But he knew, with a certainty that settled in his gut like cold stone, that he would. The paper crinkled under his thumb, Cisadilla 2, Cisadilla 3, brown wrapping hiding the bitter dust inside. Thorne slid the packet into his waistcoat pocket, feeling the weight of it against his ribs like a second heart beating slow and toxic. Vane's pen stopped scratching. The nib hovered above the ledger, a drop of ink swelling at the tip until it grew too heavy and fell, blotting the page with a dark, expanding star. "Careful, sealers. Evidence requires handling. Evidence requires survival." Vane dipped the pen again, the movement fluid, practiced, as if he was signing a death warrant rather than a catalogue entry. "You take that from this room, you take my authority, you take my protection. Do not imagine the world outside these walls cares for your truth." Thorne stood, the chair legs scraping Harrow against the flagstones, a sudden violence in the quiet room. His knees stiffened, joints protesting the hours spent hunched over the dead words of 1531. He looked down at the indictment, the vellum pale and sickly in the candlelight. "Richard Roose, boiled alive." The ink was dry now, fixed and immutable, yet Thorne felt the heat of the pot rising through the floorboards, smelling the phantom steam of cooking flesh that had no business haunting a clerical office in Chancery Lane. "The world outside cares for nothing," Thorne said. "It eats and sleeps and forgets. That is why we are here." "We are here to preserve," Vane snapped, the mask slipping further to reveal the raw nerve beneath. "Not to judge. Judgment is for God or for Henry VIII, not for a clerk with a grief he cannot manage. Grief is manageable. It is justice that resists the ledger." Thorne turned away from the desk, leaving Vane surrounded by the papers, the ink, the tools of his bureaucracy. He walked to the window, the glass cold against his palm, the fog outside pressing close like a living thing. Down in the street, a cart wheel clattered over the cobbles, the sound muffled by the mist, and for a moment he imagined it was the tumbril carrying Roose to Smithfield, the wood groaning under the weight of a man destined for the cauldron. He touched the packet in his pocket again, ensuring it was there, ensuring the poison was no longer Vane's to distribute. "You will be watched," Vane said, his voice low, devoid of the earlier anger. "The morning shift knows your face. They know your hours. Do not think you can walk out of here with state property and vanish into the fog." "I am not vanishing." Thorne turned back, the candle light carving deep hollows into his cheeks. "I am finishing the work. You said it yourself. The record must be complete." "The record I authorize." The record exists whether you sign it or not. Thorne moved towards the door, his boots heavy on the floor. Aris knew that. He knew the truth was heavier than the lie. Vane stood up then, the chair scraping back, his height suddenly apparent in the dim room. He looked tired, the lines around his mouth deep-etched, the color drained from his face by the long night and the confessions wrung from him. He reached for the candle, shielding the flame with a cupped hand, as if protecting a fragile bird from the wind. Aris was weak, Vane said. He wanted peace. I gave it to him. Do not punish me for granting him what you could not. Thorne's hand rested on the iron latch of the door. The metal was cold, biting into his skin, grounding him in the physical reality of the moment. He could feel the hellebore against his chest, a secret burden, a promise of leverage or destruction depending on how the next days unfolded. He thought of the 42 days remaining until the anniversary of the Act's repeal, a countdown ticking in his head like a clock wrapped in wool. Peace is not the same as silence, Thorne said. You confused the two. He opened the door. The corridor outside was darker than the office, the gas jets dimmed to embers by the night watchman, casting long shadows that stretched towards him like grasping fingers. The air here was colder, smelling of dust and old stone, the scent of a tomb sealed for centuries. He stepped out, leaving Vane in the pool of candlelight, and pulled the door shut until it clicked, the sound final and absolute. For a moment he stood there, listening. Inside the room he heard the scratch of the quill resume, Vane returning to the work, to the order, to the lie. Outside the building groaned, the timbers settling, the pipes cooling. He began to walk, his footsteps echoing on the flagstones, counting the paces to the stairs. 1, 2, 3. He reached the landing and paused, looking down into the well of the stairwell where the darkness was total. A sound rose from below, not the wind, not the settling of the building. A footstep, heavy, deliberate, waiting on the landing beneath him. Thorne froze, his hand tightening on the banister, the wood rough and splintered under his grip. He held his breath, the air cold in his lungs, and listened again. The footstep shifted, a scuff of leather on stone, someone moving into the shadow of the archway. He was not alone in the building. The morning shift did not arrive for 2 hours. Thorne reached into his pocket and closed his fingers around the packet of hellebore, the paper crunching softly. He began to descend, step by step, into the dark. The second footstep scraped against stone, lower down, closer to the ground floor landing. Thorne halted, his hand tightening on the banister until the wood bit into his palm, splinters digging into the skin. Darkness pooled in the well of the stairwell, thick and suffocating, swallowing the hem of his coat and the toes of his boots. He held his breath, listening to the settling of the building, the groan of timber that sounded too much like a human sigh. Who is there? The question hung in the cold air, unanswered for a span of 10 heartbeats. Then a match flared below, the sulfur scent rising to meet him, sharp and acrid. The flame illuminated a face worn by age and tobacco, the deep lines around the mouth resembling cracks in dry earth. It was the night watchman, Gower, a man who had swept these floors since before the Crimean War, whose loyalty belonged to the building rather than the men who worked within it. Late hour for a senior clerk, Gower said, shielding the match with a cupped hand. Vane usually has the locks turned by 11. Vane is occupied. Thorne resumed his descent, each step deliberate, testing the tread before committing his weight. I require air. The office is stifling. Stifling, Gower snorted, the sound rough in the quiet. That's one word for it, dust mostly, gets in the lungs, stays there, like soot. Thorne reached the landing where the watchman stood, the faint light from the match casting long, dancing shadows against the peeling plaster. He could smell the stale beer on Gower's breath, mixed with the tang of the phosphorus match. The packet in his coat pocket pressed against his thigh, a hard square of paper containing crushed roots and lethal potential. He kept his hand near it, not touching, but hovering, ready to crush the contents if necessary. You heard nothing, Thorne said. You saw no one leave this floor. I see many things, Mr. Thorne. Gower dropped the match, grinding it out with his heel. Most of it best forgotten. Vane pays me to watch the doors, not the consciences of the clerks. Then watch the door. Thorne moved past him, shoulder brushing the rough wool of the watchman's coat. And keep the key in your pocket. Keys burn holes, sir. Ask anyone who's carried them long enough. Gower stepped aside, allowing passage, but his eyes followed Thorne's movement, tracking the bulge in the coat. "You walk like a man carrying a coffin, heavy on the heels." "Good night, Gower." "Night, sir, mind the fog. It's thick enough to choke a horse out there." Thorne pushed open the heavy oak door leading to the street, the iron latch cold enough to burn. Outside, Chancery Lane lay submerged in a yellow soup, the gas lamps reduced to double-cisadilla 3 halos that offered little illumination. The moisture clung to his face, dampening his whiskers, settling on his eyelashes like fine dew. He turned left, towards Fleet Street, his stride lengthening as the distance from the record office grew. The cobblestones were slick, reflecting the dim light, and the sound of his boots echoed off the narrow buildings, a rhythmic companionship in the empty street. He needed to walk. The confinement of the office, the scrutiny of Vane, the weight of the indictment, it all pressed against his skull, demanding release. The hellebore in his pocket felt warm, as if it possessed a biological heat of its own, a dormant life waiting to be activated. He thought of the boiling pot at Smithfield, the steam rising from the cauldron, the way the law demanded flesh be rendered down to nothingness, a legal erasure. Just as Vane sought to erase the margin notes, to scrub the doubt from the vellum. A hansom cab rattled past, the horse's hooves striking sparks from the stones, the driver huddled deep within his cloak. Thorne stepped closer to the wall, avoiding the mud sprayed by the wheels. He had no destination in mind, only the need to put distance between himself and the room where Vane sat scratching his quill, rewriting history one line at a time. The grief sat in his chest, a solid lump that refused to dissolve, mirroring the undigested poison he carried. Aris had walked these same streets, perhaps in this same fog, the arsenic already working in his blood, turning his organs to mush while he sought help that would not come. Thorne stopped at a corner, leaning against the brickwork to catch his breath. The damp seeped through his coat, chilling the bone. He pulled the packet from his pocket, unfolding the paper under the shelter of a shop awning. The dried roots lay inside, grey and brittle, smelling of earth and bitterness. He touched one with a fingertip, rolling it until it crumbled into dust. A small amount could sicken. A larger amount could kill. It was the same powder that had taken Alice Trippitt, the same that had killed his brother. Chemistry did not distinguish between murder and justice. It only obeyed the hand that administered it. "Careful with that." Thorne snapped the paper shut, spinning around. A figure stood in the shadow of the awning, barely visible against the dark brick. A woman, wrapped in a shawl, her face obscured by the collar turned up against the damp. She held a basket at her hip, the smell of stale bread rising from it. "I didn't hear you approach," Thorne said, slipping the packet back into his coat. "Fog muffles the feet," she replied, her voice low, lacking the deference of a servant. "You look like a man who hasn't slept since Michaelmas." "Observant." "Observant keeps a body fed." She shifted the basket, the movement fluid. "You're the clerk from the record office. Thorne, I've seen you walking this route before, always alone, always looking at the ground." "And you are?" "Someone who knows when a man is carrying something he shouldn't." She stepped closer, the smell of yeast and sourdough intensifying. "Vane has men watching the streets, not just Gower, others, better paid." Thorne's hand went to his pocket again, fingers curling around the paper. "Why tell me?" "Because Vane owes me wages, and I dislike being unpaid." She turned away, merging back into the fog before he could question her further. "Lambeth is watched too, don't go straight there." She vanished into the yellow haze, leaving Thorne standing alone under the awning. The warning settled in his gut, heavier than the bread smell. He looked down the street, towards the river, the path to Lambeth now blocked by invisible eyes. He could return to the office, surrender the packet, accept Vane's version of the truth, or he could walk until the fog swallowed him whole. He pushed off from the wall, turning right instead of left, away from the river, away from the known path. The city stretched out before him, a labyrinth of brick and shadow, hiding more secrets than the vellum rolls in the archive. He walked faster, the cold air burning his lungs, the packet pressing against his hip like a second heart. Footsteps echoed behind him, not the rhythmic clip of a handsome horse, nor the shuffling drag of a drunkard seeking a gutter. Measured, deliberate. Thorne did not turn. To look was to admit the fear, and fear made a man sloppy. He kept his gaze fixed on the wet gleam of the pavement, where the gaslight bled into the puddles like spilled oil. The fog thickened, pressing against his eyes, reducing the world to a circle of 10 yards. Brickwork loomed on the left, a wall of black on the right. He turned right at the next junction, taking a narrow alley that smelled of stale urine and rotting cabbage. The footsteps paused, then resumed. Matching his pace. Thorne quickened, his breath hitched in his throat, a ragged sound that seemed too loud in the muffled street. The packet in his coat pocket bumped against his ribs with every stride, a hard knot of paper and root. He could feel the dust of the hellebore through the layers, a phantom itch on his skin. Aris had complained of itching before the end, a rash on the wrists. Thorne had told him it was the ink, a lie told to save a brother from the shame of carelessness. Now the lie sat in his pocket, dry and brittle. He emerged onto Fleet Street, the wider thoroughfare offering no comfort. The shadows here were deeper, the corners more numerous. A constable stood near the junction, leaning on his truncheon, the bullseye lantern at his belt casting a cone of weak light onto the wet stones. Thorne considered approaching him, a plea for protection, but Vane's influence reached into the stations. The Metropolitan Police were not immune to the bribes of a senior clerk with friends in the Treasury. To speak was to risk. He walked past the constable, keeping his head bowed. The officer's eyes tracked him, dull and uninterested. "Late night, sir," the constable said. The voice was flat, devoid of curiosity. "Work," Thorne replied. He did not stop. "Mind the cut purses, fog's thick enough to hide a blade." "I have nothing worth taking." Thorne pushed on, the lie tasting of copper. He had the indictment memorized. He had the poison. He had the grief, all of it valuable, all of it dangerous. He spotted the glow of a coffee house sign swinging above a doorway, the letters, the Turk's head barely visible through the haze. Warmth spilled from the open door, carrying the scent of roasted beans and tobacco smoke. A refuge or a trap. He stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled, a cheerful sound that clashed with the tension in his shoulders. The room was sparse, occupied by two other men huddled over newspapers, their faces obscured by broadsheets. A woman stood behind the counter, wiping a porcelain cup with a rag that looked dirtier than the cup itself. "Coffee," Thorne said. He kept his coat buttoned. "Black, please." She poured the liquid from a pot sitting on a hot plate. Steam rose in a thin ribbon. Thorne took the cup, the heat seeping into his frozen fingers. He moved to a table in the corner, positioning himself so he could see the door and the window. The glass was fogged, obscuring the street outside. He wiped a circle clear with his sleeve. A figure stood across the street, motionless, wearing a dark coat and a hat pulled low. The man did not look at the coffee house. He looked at the door, waiting. Thorne set the cup down. The liquid trembled, ripples spreading across the surface. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the paper packet. The woman approached, placing a saucer on the table. "Sugar's extra," she said. "I don't take sugar." "Suit yourself," she lingered, her eyes flicking to the window, then back to his face. "You're not the first one tonight." Thorne stiffened. "What do you mean?" "Man came in an hour ago, asked if a clerk had been through, described your coat, grey wool, stain on the left cuff." She touched her own cuff, a mimicry of the description. "Said you owed money." "Did he pay for his coffee?" "No," she turned away, wiping the counter again. "He paid with a warning." Thorne stood. The chair scraped against the floorboards, a harsh shriek in the quiet room. He left the coffee untouched. The heat from the cup remained on his palm, a ghost of warmth. He walked to the door, pushing it open without looking back. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The figure across the street moved, stepping off the curb, crossing towards him. Thorne did not run. Running confirmed guilt. He walked briskly, turning left into the shadow of a building site. Timber scaffolding rose into the fog, a skeleton of a structure that would not be finished for years. He slipped between the planks, the mud sucking at his boots. The sound of pursuit followed, heavy boots on wet wood. "Mr. Thorne." The voice came from behind, close. Thorne stopped. He turned slowly. The man stood 10 feet away, hands in his pockets. He was younger than Thorne, with a clean-shaven face that looked too smooth for the weather. A clerk's face, or a spy's. "Who sent you?" Thorne asked. His voice was steady, betraying none of the tremor in his hands. Mr. Vane concerns himself with office efficiency, not street corners. The man stepped closer. The gaslight caught the metal of a watch chain at his waist, but he does worry about missing property. I took nothing. Information is property, especially when it concerns the Crown's legal history. The man tilted his head. Give me the packet. It's hellebore. It's evidence. Thorne's hand tightened around the packet in his pocket. The dried roots crumbled further, turning to powder against his palm. He could feel the texture, gritty and dry. Aris had swallowed powder, dissolved in tea, sweetened with sugar. Thorne looked at the man, seeing not an enemy but a functionary, a tool, Vane's tool. Vane knows you're here, the man said. He knows you walked this way. He knows you stopped at the coffee house. Then he knows I left it. Left what? The packet, Thorne lied. The words felt heavy on his tongue. I dropped it in the alley, back near Chancery. The man's eyes narrowed. He scanned Thorne's coat, looking for the bulge. You're lying. Check the alley, Thorne took a step back. Or check the coffee house, ask the woman, she saw me drop it. A hesitation, the man weighed the options. To search the alley was to lose time. To search the coffee house was to admit weakness. He glanced towards the street, where the fog swallowed the light. If you have it, the man said, you're a dead man. Vane doesn't like loose ends. Then tell him I'm already dead. Thorne turned and walked into the scaffolding, deeper into the shadows of the unfinished building. He heard the man curse, a sharp intake of breath. No footsteps followed immediately. Thorne moved silently, navigating the timber maze by touch. He reached the far side, emerging onto a parallel street he did not recognize. He walked fast. The lie would hold for minutes, maybe 10. He needed to be gone. The packet burned against his hip. He could not go home. He could not go to the office. The city was closing in, the streets narrowing like a noose. He needed a place where Vane's reach did not extend, a place of the dead. He turned towards the river, not Lambeth, not yet. There was a churchyard near the water, old stones sinking into the mud. The dead did not speak. They did not tell tales to chief clerks. He would wait there until the fog lifted, or until the poison took him. He reached the embankment. The water lapped against the stairs, black and oily. A wherryman sat in a boat, smoking a pipe, the ember glowing like a single eye in the dark. Waterman, Thorne said. The man looked up. Where to? Downstream, away from the bridges. Cost you a shilling. Thorne tossed the coin. It landed in the bottom of the boat with a clink. He stepped in, the wood rocking beneath his weight. The wherryman pushed off, the oars dipping into the Thames. The city receded, the gas lamps fading into the mist. Thorne sat in the stern, the packet still in his pocket. He was moving, but the water flowed both ways, and the tide was turning. Oars dipped. The water accepted the wood without complaint, swallowing the blade until the varnish vanished beneath the black slick off the tide. Thorne sat still, his back pressed against the stern seat, rough timber digging into the spine, while the wherryman worked the sculls with a rhythmic grunt that matched the slap of water against the hull. Coal smoke drifted low, stinging the eyes, carrying the sulfur tang of 1,000 domestic fires burning across the invisible city. Keep going, Thorne said. We are past Blackfriars. The wherryman did not turn. His shoulders rolled with the pull, muscles shifting under a coat patched with grease. Fogs thickening near the bridge, hard to see the pilings. Past the bridge. Costs more. I have coin. Coin don't buy sight. The oars lifted, dripping. For a moment only the river noise remained, the gurgle of waste and the distant hoot of a steamer whistle cutting through the damp. You're running from something, Clark. I can smell it on you. Thorne said nothing. His hand found the bulk in his waistcoat. The paper packet sat against his ribs, hard and angular, containing the dried roots of hellebore, poison, medicine. The distinction relied entirely on the hand that stirred the pot. Aris had taken powder in tea, sweetened. The memory arrived unbidden, sharp as a splinter under the fingernail, bringing with it the image of his brother's throat closing, the desperate clawing at the collar that had saved nothing. Richard Roose had stirred a pot, not tea porridge, for the bishop's household. The same white powder, different century, same result. Alice Trippitt dead, Bernard Cowan dead, Fishes surviving by the grace of a full stomach or a lighter spoon, the law demanded boiling for the cook. Henry VII required a spectacle to warn the others. Thorne rubbed the paper through the wool. The roots crumbled further, dusting his palm with gritty fragments that smelled of earth and decay. "Turn here," Thorne said. He pointed towards the southern bank, where the shadows clustered thick around the water's edge. Lambeth, the wherryman slowed the stroke. The boat drifted, momentum dying. Nothing there but mud and the bishop's wall, no landing stage worth the name. "Put me ashore. You'll sink in the muck." "Put me ashore." Thorne leaned forward. The boat rocked. "Or I walk the rest of the way in shallow water." The wherryman spat into the Thames. A small ripple spread from the spot, vanishing quickly. He swung the bow towards the bank, navigating by instinct more than sight, the keel scraping against submerged stones before grounding in the soft silt. Thorne stood, his legs stiff from the cold. He stepped onto the bank, boots sinking an inch into the slime. "Wait." Thorne paused, 1 foot on the solidifying mud. "If you're meeting someone," the wherryman said, "they're late, or they're watching." Thorne looked back. The river was a void behind them, the city lights reduced to double Cisadilla, 3 halos in the fog. No other boat followed. Yet, he tossed the shilling. It struck the thwarts with a dull clink. "Push off." The wherryman shoved the boat back into the current without another word. The oars caught the water, pulling the vessel away, leaving Thorne alone on the bank. The silence returned, heavier now, pressing against the ears. He turned towards the land. A path led up from the water, worn by the feet of bargemen and laundry women, climbing towards the road that ran alongside the palace walls. Thorne walked. The mud sucked at his boots, making a wet tearing sound with every step. He climbed. The air grew slightly clearer away from the water's surface, though the fog still clung to the ground like spilled milk. He reached the pavement, stone flags, cold and slick. Here the history lay underfoot. 300 years ago, men had walked this same stretch carrying bowls of gruel. They had sat in the hall behind the wall, laughing perhaps, before the pain started. Thorne placed a hand against the brickwork of the boundary wall. Damp seeped through the glove, chilling the bone. He closed his eyes. The image of the cauldron surfaced, unbidden. Iron suspended over fire, water heating. A man strapped to a chair lowered slowly. The law required it, boiling alive. No quicker death allowed. The state insisted on the mirror, poison killed in secret, so the law must kill in steam. Thorne opened his eyes. The wall remained solid, unyielding. No ghosts. Only brick and mortar and the distant rumble of a carriage on the main road. He walked along the pavement, keeping the wall to his left. The packet in his waistcoat felt heavier now, dragging the fabric down. He needed to find the spot. The kitchen had been inside, but the smell of the cooking would have drifted out. Would it? Or had the fear smelled stronger? Vane's man would not stop at the alley lie. He would check the coffee house. He would find the woman. She would tell the truth. Thorne stopped. A shadow detached itself from the wall further down. Not a man, a cat slinking into a drain. He exhaled, the breath pluming white. His fingers tightened around the packet. The hellebore was the link. Roose had used it, or someone had used it and blamed him. The indictment said willful murder. The margin asked why. Thorne had written the question. Now he stood on the ground where the answer died. He moved forward again. The pavement ended at a gate, iron bars rusted through. Beyond lay the palace grounds, dark and forbidden. He could not enter, not tonight, but he did not need to enter to know the ground remembered. The cold rose through the soles of his boots, seizing the ankles. He stamped his foot. The sound echoed flatly. A noise came from the street behind, a hoof striking stone, a horse, coming slow. Thorne stepped into the recess of the gate, pressing his back against the cold iron. The carriage passed, wheels rumbling, windows dark. It did not stop. He waited until the sound faded, then stepped back onto the pavement. He pulled the packet from his waistcoat. The paper was torn now, edges frayed from his handling. He tore a corner off, put it in his mouth. The taste was bitter, earthy, clinging to the tongue. He spat it into the gutter. The poison sat on his tongue for a moment before the rain washed it away. He was testing the evidence, or testing himself. Could he swallow it? Would it kill him like Aris, like Alice? No, he needed to keep it. Evidence, proof. But proof of what? That Roose was guilty, or that he was a scapegoat for a crime committed by someone with a higher title. Bishop Fisher survived, the servants died, the cook boiled, the king signed the act. Thorne shoved the packet back. His hand trembled. He clasped his wrist to steady it. He looked down the street. The fog shifted. A figure stood at the corner, motionless, watching. Thorne turned away, walking faster along the wall. He knew the way to Smithfield from here. It was not far, the place of execution. If the packet was the key, the boiling pot was the lock. He had to see the ground. He had to stand where the fire was lit. The cold bit through his coat. He buttoned it tight. The figure at the corner did not move. Thorne kept walking. The pavement stretched out, wet and grey. He counted his steps. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm kept the fear at bay. He would not run, not yet. The river was behind him. The city was ahead, and the dead were waiting in the stones. Bitterness coated the tongue. Thorne scraped his teeth with a thumbnail, trying to dislodge the grit of the sample, but the flavor of rotten earth stayed put, clinging to the gums like a promise kept too long. He walked. The pavement stretched ahead, a ribbon of grey stone cutting through the fog that rolled off the Thames in thick, oily sheets. Gas lamps sputtered overhead, their yellow eyes struggling against the damp, casting pools of light that barely reached the ground before dying out into the gloom. He kept to the edge of the road, boots clicking on the cobbles, listening for the hoofbeats behind him. Nothing, only the distant rattle of a cart wheel and the cry of a night bird somewhere in the rigging of a moored lighter. The packet sat against his ribs, heavy as a lead weight. He pressed a hand to his waistcoat, feeling the outline of the paper through the wool. Inside lay the powder that killed Alice Trippitt, or did it? The indictment said willful murder. The margin asked why. Thorne had written the question. Now he carried the answer in his pocket, or perhaps he carried only more dust. Alice had died with white powder on his lips too. No indictment for that death. No boiling pot. Just a quiet room in Bloomsbury and a brother who stopped breathing before the doctor could bleed him. Thorne swallowed. The bile rose, acidic and sharp. He forced it down. A shadow moved ahead. Not a cat this time. A man in a blue coat, helmet gleaming dull under the lamp. A constable. Thorne slowed his pace, adjusting his collar to hide the lower half of his face. The officer stepped into the light, hand resting on the truncheon at his belt. "Passing late," the constable said. His voice was flat, devoid of curiosity, trained by years of walking the same beat. "Business," Thorne replied. He did not stop walking. "Business waits for morning." The officer shifted his weight, blocking the path. "Lambeth isn't safe for gentlemen after dark. Thieves, drunks, worse." "I know the way." Thorne stepped around him, shoulder brushing the blue wool of the uniform. The constable turned, boots scraping on the stone. "Name?" "Thorne. Public office." "Record office." Thorne kept moving. He did not look back. He heard the officer mutter something low in his throat, a sound of dismissal or warning, and then the footsteps resumed their patrol rhythm, fading into the mist. Thorne exhaled, a long stream of white vapor that hung in the air before dissipating. His hands were shaking. He shoved them into his pockets, fingers curling around the packet again. The paper crinkled. A small sound, loud in the empty street. He turned left towards Westminster Bridge. The fog thickened here, pressing against his face, wet and cold. It smelled of coal smoke and river mud, the scent of a city that burned coal to keep the dark at bay. He thought of Richard Roose, the cook, strapped to a chair, lowered into the water. The Act of Parliament demanded it. No hanging, no beheading, boiling, a mere punishment for poisoners who killed in secret. The state wanted the public to see the steam rise. Thorne could see it now, superimposed over the fog. White vapor rising from a cauldron set into the ground at Smithfield. Screams muffled by the water before it reached the boil. How long did it take? 10 minutes? 20? The records did not say. They only recorded the sentence and the completion. Thorne stumbled on an uneven flagstone, catching himself against a brick wall. Damp mortar stained his glove. He wiped it on his coat, leaving a grey smear. The cold seeped through the fabric, biting into his skin. He needed to keep moving. Stopping meant thinking. Thinking meant remembering Aris lying on the floor, eyes open, mouth foaming slightly. The doctor had called it a fit. Thorne knew better. Aris had been researching the Tudor courts. He had found something about the Poisons Act, something about Fisher. Thorne reached the bridge. The river below was black, invisible save for the ripple of water against the pilings. A steamer passed underneath, paddle wheels churning the sludge, sparks flying from the funnel to die in the fog. The noise was deafening for a moment, then gone, leaving the silence ringing in his ears. He crossed to the north bank. Smithfield was close now. He could feel it in the tension of his shoulders, the way his neck tightened as he approached the site of the execution. The ground there was holy in a way the church would not acknowledge, sanctified by pain. He turned off the main road, navigating by memory and the faint glow of a distant lamp post. The streets narrowed here, lined with warehouses and locked shops, the shutters drawn tight against the night. A rat scurried across the gutter, pausing to sniff at a discarded cabbage leaf before vanishing into a hole. Thorne stopped at the corner. This was it, the open ground where the crowd had gathered in 1531, where Henry VII's law was enacted. He stepped into the center of the space. The cobbles were uneven, worn smooth by centuries of traffic. No monument marked the spot. No plaque remembered Roose, just the street name and the memory in the books. Thorne closed his eyes. He tried to summon the heat, the fire, the water, but all he felt was the damp cold of 1862 seeping through his boots. He opened his eyes. The fog swirled around his ankles. He pulled the packet from his waistcoat. The paper was damp now, softening in his grip. He tore it open. The powder inside was gray, clumping together from the humidity. He held it out on his palm. "Was it you?" he whispered. The words hung in the air unanswered. Or was it him? He waited. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of roasting meat from a distant kitchen, perhaps a pie shop preparing for the morning market. The scent clashed with the memory of boiling flesh. Thorne clenched his fist. The powder crushed between his fingers, fine dust coating his skin. He did not wipe it off. He let it stay there, a mark of the dead. A constable's whistle blew in the distance, sharp and urgent. Not his constable. Another beat. Something was happening. The sound came from the direction of the record office. Thorne froze. He listened. Another blast. Closer. He shoved the packet back into his pocket. The dust on his hands stained the wool of his gloves. He looked towards the sound, then back at the empty ground where Roose had died. The choice sat in his chest, heavy and hard. Go back to the office and face Vane, or stay here and wait for the truth to rise from the stones. He turned on his heel. The whistle blew again. Someone was calling for help, or calling for him. Thorne began to run. His lungs burned, a fire stoked by coal smoke, air dragging oxygen into a chest that felt too tight for the grief lodged inside. Pavement blurred underfoot, the uneven flags of Holbeck giving way to the smoother stone of Chancery Lane, each impact jarring a knee that had not known such violence in years. He did not slow. The whistle had cut the fog like a blade, sharp and directional, pulling him back towards the iron gates of the record office where the gas jets should have been extinguished an hour past. Yet a yellow glow leaked from the upper windows, sickly and persistent, staining the mist above the roofline. Thorne skidded around the corner, boot heels scraping against the wet granite, and slammed a shoulder against the heavy oak door. It yielded, unlocked. Inside, the air hung stagnant, thick with the scent of dry rot and iron gall ink that had settled into the fibers of his wool coat over the last decade of service. He wiped his palms on his trousers, forgetting the grey powder still ground into the skin, and left smudged prints on the varnished banister as he took the stairs two at a time. The corridor stretched before him, lined with shelves that rose into darkness like the bars of a prison cell. At the far end, a single gas jet hissed, casting long shadows that danced against the walls. Silas Vane stood beneath it. He held a lantern in one hand, the glass clouded with soot, and a ledger in the other. He did not look up as Thorne approached, though his shoulders stiffened, a subtle tightening of the muscle beneath the black broadcloth. "You are out of uniform, Mr. Thorne." Vane's voice was flat, devoid of curiosity, trained by years of walking the same beat within these walls. "I was walking." Thorne stopped 3 paces away. He kept his hands visible, though the right one twitched, the dust itching between his fingers. The whistle. "Constable Miller, drunk in the gutter near Fleet Street, nothing to do with us." Vane closed the ledger with a snap that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. He finally raised his eyes. They were pale, watery, reflecting the gaslight like oil on water. "You left your station. The bins were checked." "I needed air." "Air does not require absence." Vane stepped closer, the lantern swinging slightly, sending shadows lurching across the floorboards. and it does not require you to return with the smell of Smithfield on your clothes. Do you know what that ground costs, Thorne, in reputation, in history? It costs blood. Thorne heard the words leave his mouth before he could check them. They hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. It costs boiling water. Vane's expression did not change, but the hand holding the lantern tightened, knuckles whitening against the brass handle. You have been reading too much. The archives are for cataloguing, not for conjuring ghosts. Go to your alcove, secure the Tudor rolls, then go home. The Roose indictment, Thorne did not move. It was on my desk. It is where it belongs, in the bin. Vane turned, walking towards the partition that shielded Thorne's station, unless you moved it. I did not move it. Thorne followed him. The floorboards creaked under his weight, a rhythmic protest against the intrusion. I left it open, to dry. Nothing dries in this building, everything rots. Vane stopped at the partition. He reached inside, his arm disappearing into the shadows of the alcove, and withdrew a bundle of vellum. The wrap was loose, the string untied. He held it out. Thorne took it. The parchment felt cold, damp from the fog that had seeped through the window sash during his absence. He unwrapped the corner. The indictment was there, the jagged handwriting, the names, Alice Trippitt, Burnett Curwen, but the margin was different. The word "why" he had written in a moment of breach was gone, scraped away. The surface of the vellum was rough, the fibers raised where a knife had been dragged across the ink to remove it. Thorne ran a thumb over the spot. The skin caught on the abrasion. He looked at Vane. Damage must be recorded, Vane said. He did not blink. You know the protocol. Annotation is forbidden. Speculation is treason. It was an accident. Was it? Vane tilted his head. The lantern light carved deep hollows into his cheeks, making him look like a skull wrapped in parchment. Or was it a confession? You write like a man who seeks absolution from the dead. They do not grant it, Thorne, not here. Thorne clenched the bundle. The vellum crinkled. Aris wrote in the margins. Your brother is dead. Vane's voice dropped, losing its bureaucratic edge, becoming something sharper, personal. And he died because he could not distinguish between the record and the dream. Do not follow him into the dark. It is crowded enough. He found something. Thorne stepped forward, invading Vane's space. The smell of the older man was stale tobacco and old paper, a scent of preservation that masked decay. About the act, about Fisher, you know what it was. I know what is written. Vane stepped back, reclaiming the distance. And I know what is missing. The bins are lighter, Thorne. Documents are leaving this building, not on my order. Then who? That is what you will find out. Vane turned away, lifting the lantern. The light swung, casting Thorne's shadow long and distorted against the shelves. Or you will be removed. The autumn session begins in 40 days. The chief archivist expects the Tudor miscellany to be complete. If the Roose file is not in order, you will not be the one to lose your position. You will be the one to lose your freedom. Access to state papers is a privilege, not a right. Vane walked away. His boots made no sound on the flagstones, a trick of weight distribution learned over 30 years of silent patrol. Thorne stood alone in the corridor. The gas jet hissed above him, a constant, insect-like whisper that competed with the scratching of quills on vellum that existed only in his memory. He looked down at the indictment. The scraped margin stared back, a white wound on the aged skin of the document. He could feel the texture of it through the paper, a ridge of trauma that matched the one on his own palm where the powder had stained the skin. He returned to his alcove. The partition offered no real privacy, merely the illusion of it. He sat on the wooden stool, the legs wobbling slightly on the uneven floor. He placed the indictment on the desk. He picked up his quill. The nib was dry. He dipped it into the inkwell. The liquid was thick, sluggish. He touched the nib to the paper next to the scraped area. He did not write. He held the pen there, a black drop swelling at the tip, threatening to fall. Outside, the city continued its work. A cart rumbled past on the street below, the iron rims grinding against the stone. A dog barked, sharp and lonely. Thorne lowered the pen. He opened the drawer of his desk. Inside, beneath a stack of ledgers, lay the letter he had written to Aris 3 weeks ago. The seal was unbroken. He took it out. The paper was crisp, expensive stock that he could not afford. He turned it over in his hands. 40 days, he said to the empty room. The words sounded flat, absorbed by the dust motes dancing in the sickly yellow light. He placed the letter beside the indictment, 2 documents, one dead brother, one dead cook, both boiled by the state in different ways. He blew out the candle on his desk. The darkness rushed in, immediate and total, save for the faint glow from the corridor where Vane's lantern was fading into the distance. Thorne remained seated. He listened to the building settle, the timber groaning as the temperature dropped. He waited for the sound of footsteps returning. They did not come. Instead, a new sound emerged from the basement below, a rhythmic thudding that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of his boots. Someone was down there, and they were not cataloguing. Thorne stood. The stool scraped the flagstones, a harsh shriek that vanished into the gloom before he could advance towards the corridor. He did not think of Vane, or the 40 days, or the letter sitting in the desk beside the indictment of a cook who had died 3 centuries prior. The thudding came again, dull and wet, impacting wood that echoed up the stairwell like a hammer striking meat. He moved. The corridor swallowed him. The gas lamp at the far end flickered, its yellow eyes struggling against the draft that slipped under the exterior doors, carrying the scent of coal smoke and wet horse dung from Chancery Lane. Thorne kept to the wall, his hand trailing along the cold iron shelving until his fingers found the rough grain of the doorframe leading to the basement stairs. The air grew heavier here, pressing against his lungs with the weight of stored paper and the damp rot of foundations that had settled into the Thames mud long before the Crown decided to boil its traitors. He descended. Each step groaned under his weight, a complaint of timber that seemed too loud in the stillness. At the bottom, the darkness thickened. A single candle burned on a crate near the far wall, its flame trembling in a draught that had no source. Beside it, a figure stood over a stack of ledgers, their back turned, shoulders hunched against the cold that seeped through the stone walls. They wore a shawl of dark wool, pulled tight over the head, obscuring the hair and the shape of the face. Thorne stopped at the foot of the stairs. His boots settled into the dust. "You are not Vane," he said. The words hung in the air, flat and useless. The figure turned. A woman. Her face was pale in the candlelight, the eyes dark and hollowed by exhaustion, but her hands were steady as she closed the ledger she had been reading. She wore gloves, black leather stained with ink at the fingertips. "Vane sends boys to do his watching. He does not come himself." "Who are you?" Thorne took a step forward. The distance between them was 10 feet, filled with floating dust motes that danced in the candle's glow. "And what are you doing with the Tudor miscellany?" "Reading." She lifted the ledger, holding it against her chest, as if it were a child needing protection from the cold. "Something you should stop doing, Clark, before the ink stains more than your fingers. These documents are state property." "They are grave." She stepped around the crate, moving towards the shadows of the far alcove where the iron safe stood open, its door gaping like a broken jaw. "And someone is digging them up. Not you, not Vane, others." Thorne blocked her path. He could smell her now, beneath the wool and the dust, a faint scent of lavender water that reminded him of the bottle that had sat on Aris's dressing table before the end. "My brother worked here, Aris Thorne. He died accessing these records." The woman paused, her grip on the ledger tightened, the leather creaking under the pressure. "Your brother asked questions the Crown did not want answered. He looked for the margin where the knife had been. He found it." "Where is it?" Thorne's voice dropped, losing its bureaucratic edge, becoming something sharper, personal. "The missing folio, the one Vane says is lighter." "Gone." She shifted her weight, preparing to move past him. "And you will be next if you keep scratching at the scab. 40 days, Silas Thorne. That is all you have before the session closes. Use them to write your letters, not your indictments." She moved to slip past him, quick and silent, but Thorne caught her wrist. The leather was cold under his hand. "Give me the name." She stopped. For a moment, neither of them breathed, the only sound the sputter of the candle wick as the oil ran low. Then she pulled her arm free, leaving a smear of black ink on his cuff. Fisher knew, the bishop. He survived the porridge because he did not eat, but the record says otherwise. Someone changed the account to protect the living. Your brother found the proof, and now he is in the ground with the rest of the truth. She vanished into the shadows of the alcove, merging with the darkness so completely that Thorne wondered if she had been a trick of the light, a hallucination born of grief and gaslight. He stood alone in the basement. The candle flickered and died, plunging the room into total darkness save for the faint glow of the stairwell above. He waited for the sound of the exterior door opening. It did not come. Instead, his boot kicked something hard on the floor. He crouched, his fingers found a small object, cold and metallic. He lifted it to the faint light. A seal, broken. The wax was red, cracked down the middle, bearing the crest of the Public Record Office but stamped over with a second mark, a private sigil he did not recognize. He turned it over in his palm. Scratched into the wax, barely visible, were 3 letters. ATH. Arisen. Thorne closed his fist around the wax. The edges bit into his skin, sharp and painful. He stood, pocketing the fragment, and began the climb back to the upper floor. The stairs seemed steeper now, the air thinner, as if the building itself was resisting his ascent. When he reached his alcove, the letter to Aris still lay on the desk, white and untouched beside the scraped indictment. He picked up his quill. The nib was dry. He dipped it into the inkwell. The liquid was thick, sluggish. He touched the nib to the paper, not to the letter, but to the margin of the Roose indictment, next to the white wound where Vane's knife had scraped away his question. He did not write why, this time. He wrote a name, Fisher. The ink bled into the vellum, spreading like a bruise. Thorne blew on it, watching the gloss fade to matte black. Outside, the city continued its work. A cart rumbled past on the street below, the iron rims grinding against the stone. A dog barked, sharp and lonely. Thorne capped the inkwell. He wrapped the indictment in its vellum cover, tying the string tight. He placed the broken seal inside the wrap, between the layers of parchment, hiding it from Vane's eyes, but keeping it close to the history that demanded it. The gas jet hissed above him, a constant, insect-like whisper. He extinguished the candle. The darkness rushed in, immediate and total. He sat in the dark, listening to the building settle, the timber groaning as the temperature dropped. He waited for the sound of footsteps returning. They did not come. Instead, a new sound emerged from the corridor, the rhythmic tap of a cane against the flagstones, slow and deliberate, approaching his station. Vane was back, and he was not alone. The tapping ceased. Thorne shoved the wax into his waistcoat pocket, the jagged edge biting through the fabric and into the skin beneath. Darkness held. He kept his hands on the desk, palms flat against the wood grain, pretending to sort the piles of vellum that lay scattered like dead leaves across the surface. Light flared. A match struck somewhere in the corridor, sulfur blooming sharp and sudden before the steady hiss of the gas burner ignited above, casting long, trembling shadows that stretched across the floorboards towards his boots. Vane stepped into the pool of illumination. Beside him stood a man in a constable's uniform, the helmet tucked under one arm, the other hand resting on the truncheon at his belt. They did not speak immediately. The chief clerk surveyed the alcove with the cold detachment of a man inspecting a ledger for errors, his eyes passing over the inkwell, the quill, and finally settling on Thorne's face. Dust motes danced in the sickly yellow light, settling on the shoulders of Vane's coat like grey snow. "Working late, Mr. Thorne. The ledger requires attention." Vane moved closer, the cane tapping once against the flagstones before he stopped beside the partition. He smelled of stale tobacco and wet wool, the scent of a man who had walked the streets in the rain. "Which ledger?" "The Tudor miscellany, recataloguing." "Show me." Thorne placed his hand over the bundle. The vellum felt cool under his fingers, the texture rough and dry. He thought of the seal burning a hole in his pocket, the letters ATH scratched into the red wax like a wound. Aris had written letters too, uns ent ones, found in the drawer of his desk after the arsenic took him. "It is not yet ready for inspection, sir. The binding is fragile." Vane's expression did not change. He glanced at the constable, a brief nod that carried the weight of a command. "Fragile documents are a risk. They might be lost or stolen." "I have not left the room." "Have you not?" Vane reached out and touched the edge of the indictment. His fingernail was clean, clipped short, but dirt remained under the cuticle. "There is ink on this sheet, fresh ink." Thorne withdrew his hand. The quill lay on the desk, the nib still wet. He should have wiped it. Carelessness. A notation, standard procedure. "Read it. It is incomplete. Read it." Thorne looked at the word Fisher. The ink had bled into the vellum, spreading like a bruise. He could not say it. To speak the bishop's name aloud in this room, with this man standing there, felt like confessing to a crime he had not committed. It is a reference to John Fisher, the victim. Vane leaned in. The gaslight flickered, casting his face into momentary shadow before revealing the hard lines of his mouth. The bishop survived. The record is clear. Do not confuse the living with the dead, Mr. Thorne. It leads to errors. The record says he supped. The record says many things. Vane straightened up, adjusting his cuffs. My concern is the integrity of the archive. Your brother understood that until he did not. The air left the room. Thorne gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. He had not expected the name to be used so casually, tossed into the space between them like a coin to a beggar. Aris died of illness. Did he, Vane turned to the constable, search the desk? The officer moved forward, heavy boots sounding on the wood. Thorne did not stop him. To resist would be to admit guilt, to invite the scrutiny of the law into a matter that belonged to grief. The constable opened the drawers, one by one, the wood sliding with a dry rasp. He pulled out papers, letters, a pot of sand for drying ink. He found nothing. Nothing, sir. Vane looked at Thorne. You are hiding something. I am working. You are digging. Vane's voice dropped, losing its bureaucratic edge, becoming something sharper, personal. There are holes in this building that do not appear on the plans. Your brother fell into one. Do not follow him. Thorne met his gaze. The gas burner hissed, a constant, insect-like whisper. He found a margin where the knife had been. Did he? Vane smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. Or did he cut it there himself? The question hung in the air. Thorne thought of the woman in the basement, the warning of 40 days. She had said Vane wanted the documents lighter. He wanted them gone. I want the truth. Truth is a commodity, like ink, like paper. Vane tapped the indictment with his cane. This document belongs to the Crown, not to you, not to your dead brother. Give it to me. Thorne looked at the bundle. The string was tied tight. Inside, the seal waited. It is not finished. It is finished. Vane reached for it. Thorne pulled it back. The movement was quick, unexpected. The constable stepped forward, hand on his truncheon. Do not make this difficult. It requires annotation. It requires silence. Vane's hand hovered over the paper. You have until the end of the month to complete your duties or to resign. The choice is yours. And the investigation. There is no investigation. Vane turned away, the cane tapping against the floor. Lock up when you leave. The watchman will check the doors. He walked towards the corridor, the constable following. The light from the burner dimmed as they passed the valve, plunging the alcove into semi-darkness. Thorne sat alone. The indictment lay on the desk, untouched. He placed his hand over the word Fisher. The ink was dry now. He thought of Aris, the arsenic powder on the study floor, the lavender water, the seal in his pocket. 40 days. He picked up the quill. The nib was dry. He dipped it into the inkwell. The liquid was thick, sluggish. He touched the nib to the paper, below the name he had written. He did not write a question. He wrote a date, 30 October. The ink bled into the vellum. Thorne blew on it, watching the gloss fade to matte black. Outside, the city continued its work. A cart rumbled past on the street below, the iron rims grinding against the stone. A dog barked, sharp and lonely. Thorne capped the inkwell. He wrapped the indictment in its vellum cover, tying the string tight. He placed his hand on the bundle. It was warm. He waited for the sound of the exterior door closing. It did not come. Instead, a new sound emerged from the corridor, the rhythmic tap of a cane against the flagstones, returning. Vane had not left. He was waiting. The tapping stopped 3 paces from the partition, not the hesitant shuffle of a watchman checking locks, but the deliberate, rhythmic strike of a man who knows exactly where his prey sits. Thorne did not look up. He kept his eyes on the bundle, on the rough twine that bit into his thumb as he tightened the knot, pretending the warmth radiating from the vellum was merely the residual heat of the gas lamp and not something older, something that had survived 3 centuries of cold stone to burn against his palm now. You tie it like a noose, Mr. Thorne. Vane's voice came from the shadows, devoid of the bureaucratic drone he used for the living staff. It was flatter now, stripped of pretense. Thorne's hand froze. The twine lay slack across the indictment, a loose loop waiting to be pulled tight or cut entirely. He could feel the pulse in his wrist, a frantic drumming against the bone that had nothing to do with the cold draft seeping under the door and everything to do with the memory of Aris's study, the way the lavender water had failed to mask the bitter almond scent of the powder scattered across the floorboards. "It is standard procedure," Thorne said. His voice sounded thin, brittle as the dried ink on the page. "For preservation." Preservation. Vane stepped into the pool of yellow light. The cane rested against his leg, the silver head gleaming like a blind eye. "Is that what we call it when you rewrite the Crown's history in the margins, when you invite ghosts into a room that has been quiet for 300 years? Thorne finally lifted his gaze. The chief clerk's face was a map of hard lines, the skin pulled tight over cheekbones that seemed sharp enough to cut the fog drifting through the window. There was no anger there, only a weary impatience, the sort a man reserves for a child who refuses to understand that fire burns. "I wrote a date," Thorne said, "nothing more." "A date is a promise, and promises are dangerous things in this office." Vane moved closer, the smell of stale tobacco and damp wool rolling off him, overpowering the scent of iron gall ink. He reached out not for the bundle, but for the inkwell. His fingers hovered over the glass, tracing the rim where the liquid had crusted black. "Your brother made promises too, to find the truth, to expose the rot. He thought the past was a locked room and he had the key." "He found something." "He found a hole," Vane corrected, his voice dropping to a whisper that forced Thorne to lean in, to bridge the gap between them. "And he jumped. Do not mistake curiosity for virtue, Silas. The world is not built on truth. It is built on the stories we agree to tell so we can sleep at night. Richard Roose boiled. The bishop survived. The king signed the act. That is the story. Anything else is just noise." Thorne's hand tightened on the bundle. The vellum crinkled, a dry, protesting sound that echoed loudly in the small alcove. "Alice Trippitt died. Bernard Curwen died. They were not stories. They were people." "They were casualties," Vane snapped, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal the cold fury beneath. "Just as your brother was a casualty of his own inability to let the dead rest. Do you think I enjoy this? Do you think I spend my nights watching the shadows, waiting for some clerk to decide he knows better than the law?" He leaned in, his face inches from Thorne's. Thorne could see the faint tremor in the older man's jaw, the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. It was not the look of a villain plotting malice, but of a guardian holding back a flood with a dam made of paper and silence. "The act was repealed," Thorne said softly. "Boiling is no longer the law." "The law changes," Vane replied, straightening up and tapping the cane against the floor. "Human nature does not. Men still poison, men still kill, and men still try to boil the truth until it disappears. You think writing a date in the margin changes what happened in Lambeth? It does not. It only marks you." Thorne looked down at his hands. They were stained with ink, the black seeping into the creases of his knuckles, permanent as a tattoo. He thought of the woman in the basement, her warning about the 40 days, about the documents growing lighter as the truth was stripped away. He thought of Aris, lying still in the earth while the world moved on, indifferent to the unanswered questions rotting in his chest. "Then mark me," Thorne said. He pushed the bundle across the desk, the wood scraping against the wood, a harsh grating sound that made Vane flinch. "Take it, burn it, throw it in the Thames, but know that I have read it, know that I have seen the names." Vane stared at the bundle. For a moment, the silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, filled only by the hiss of the gas jet and the distant rumble of a cart on Chancery Lane. Then, slowly, he reached out and took the indictment. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, as if handling a religious relic rather than a legal record of a brutal execution. "You are a fool, Silas," he said, tucking the bundle under his arm. "A stubborn, grieving fool." "Perhaps." "But you are my fool." Vane turned towards the corridor, the cane tapping a steady rhythm against the flagstones. "Finish your work, complete your duties, and on the 30th of October you will hand in your resignation, quietly, with dignity, or I will ensure that your brother's name is dragged through the mud alongside yours. I will tell them he was mad, that the arsenic was not an accident, but a consequence of his instability. Thorne stood up. The chairs scraped back, a loud, jarring noise in the quiet room. "You would do that." "I will do what is necessary to keep the peace." Vane did not look back. He stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the dim light of the corridor. "The world is fragile, Mr. Thorne. Do not break it." He walked away, the sound of his footsteps fading into the darkness of the archive. Thorne stood alone in the alcove, the gaslight flickering above him, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. He looked at the desk. The inkwell sat empty, the nib of the quill dried and useless. He reached out and touched the spot where the bundle had lain. The wood was still warm. Outside, the fog pressed against the window, a thick grey wall that obscured the street, the buildings, the very shape of the city. Thorne walked to the window and pressed his hand against the glass. It was cold, shocking against his skin. He thought of Lambeth, of the river flowing black and silent, of the spot where the pot had bubbled and screamed. He thought of the date he had written, 30 October. 42 days. He turned back to the room. The shadows seemed deeper now, the corners filled with things that moved when he was not looking. He picked up the quill, snapped the nib in half, and dropped the pieces into the waste bin. Then he blew out the gas jet. The room plunged into darkness, but the image of the boiling pot remained behind his eyelids, bright and terrible, waiting for the light to return. Darkness took hold. The sulphur smell of the extinguished burner hung in the air, a cloying reminder of the fuel that kept the city's eyes open while its soul slept. Thorne stood motionless, letting the blackness settle into the pores of his skin, into the weave of his wool coat, until he was no longer a clerk in Chancery Lane, but a ghost haunting his own station. He waited for the panic to rise, the instinctive fear of a man deadened his sight, yet it did not come. Instead, a cold clarity sharpened his edges, cutting through the fog of Vane's threats. He struck the tinderbox. The spark caught the charred linen, glowing orange like a dying ember in a grate, and he nursed it into the wick of a tallow candle kept for such emergencies beneath the desk. The flame sputtered, grew steady, and cast a weak, trembling circle of light that failed to reach the corners of the alcove. Shadows clung to the iron shelves, deep and unmoving, guarding the rows of vellum like sentinels who had forgotten the sun. Thorne sat, the candle wax dripping onto the wood, and pulled the ledger towards him. It was the daily register of removed documents, a book Vane believed he controlled, a book Thorne had been copying in secret for 3 weeks. His finger traced the columns: date, item, destination, weight. The ink was fresh on the top line, Vane's own hand signing off the removal of the Roose bundle only minutes ago, but the weight column told a different story. Thorne leaned in, the heat of the candle warming his cheek, and compared the entry to the one from yesterday. Yesterday, the bundle of Tudor miscellany had been recorded at £4. Today, it registered £3 and 12 ounces. 4 ounces missing. Paper did not vanish, vellum did not evaporate, unless someone had taken it. Thieves, Thorne whispered to the candle flame. The word hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. Or editors. Closed the ledger. The leather cover made a dull thud, a sound that seemed too loud in the cramped space. If Vane was removing pages, excising sections of the indictment before they reached the public archive, then the history itself was being edited, trimmed to fit a narrative that suited the office. The Poisons Act remained on the statute book, repealed only in memory, but the evidence of its cruelty was being whittled away, ounce by ounce, until nothing remained but the clean, safe version of the law. Aris had found the hole. Now Thorne stood on the edge of it. He stood up. The chair legs scraped the flagstones, a harsh protest against the quiet. He could leave. Vane had given him until October to resign, a month to tidy his affairs and vanish into the city with his pension intact. He could walk out the door, step into the fog, and let the dead bury the dead. It would be easy, safe, the rational choice for a man with nothing but his reputation to lose. But the image of the boiling pot remained behind his eyelids, bright and terrible, and he knew that safety was a lie told by men who held the keys. Thorne blew out the candle. He did not need the light to find the basement. He knew the route by the smell of damp stone and the slope of the floorboards. He moved into the corridor, his hands brushing the cold iron of the shelves to guide him, his boots making no sound on the flagstones. The archive stretched out before him, a cavern of knowledge locked in the dark, and he felt a sudden kinship with the documents rotting in the bins, waiting to be catalogued or destroyed. They were like him, bound, numbered, disposable. A floorboard creaked ahead. Thorne stopped. He held his breath, listening to the rhythm of the building. It was not the wind. It was not the settling of the foundations. It was the weight of a footstep, deliberate and slow, coming from the direction of the stairs. Someone was waiting. The woman from the basement had warned him about the 40 days, about the documents growing lighter, and now he understood she was not speaking of decay. She was speaking of theft. "Who is there?" Thorne asked. His voice was low, barely a murmur, yet it carried further than he intended in the stillness. No answer came, only the sound of breathing, shallow and quick, from the shadows near the stairwell. Thorne stepped forward. He did not reach for a weapon, he had none. He reached for the truth, extending his hand into the dark as if to touch the face of a ghost. "I know you are not a watchman, they carry lanterns." The breathing stopped. For a heartbeat, the archive held its breath with him, the dust motes suspended in the unseen air, the weight of 300 years pressing down on the roof tiles. Then a match struck. The flare of sulfur illuminated a face pale as bone, framed by a bonnet of cheap black straw. It was the woman from the basement, the one who sorted the waste bins, her hands stained with the same ink that marked Thorne's knuckles. She held the match until it burned her fingers, then dropped it, plunging them back into the dark. "They are burning them," she said. Her voice was rough, scraped raw by cold dust. "Not just the Roose file, all of them, the ones with the margins." Thorne moved closer. He could smell the smoke on her clothes, the acrid tang of burning paper that clung to her like a second skin. Vain. The chief clerk signs the order. The porter lights the fire. She stepped into the sliver of light coming from Thorne's alcove, her eyes wide and fixed on his chest, as if looking for a heart that was no longer beating. "Your brother asked about the ash. He wanted to know where it went." Thorne's throat tightened, and he went to see. She turned towards the stairs, gesturing with a chin that trembled. "Down there, where the boilers are, the ash goes into the Thames, but not all of it." She reached into her apron and pulled out a small packet wrapped in oilcloth. She pressed it into Thorne's hand. It was warm, still holding the heat of her body, and heavy with the density of something folded tight. "He left this before he died. He said if anyone came asking, anyone who looked at the weights, I was to give it to them." Thorne closed his fingers around the packet. The oilcloth was slick, stained with grease and soot. "Why keep it?" "Because I have a son," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that barely reached him. "And I do not want him to boil for a crime he did not commit. The act is gone, Mr. Thorne, but the pot remains." She turned and walked away, her footsteps fading into the darkness of the stairwell, leaving Thorne alone with the packet and the smell of burnt paper. He looked down at his hand. The oilcloth was stained black, the edges frayed where it had been hidden in the apron for months. He could open it here, in the safety of the alcove, under the watch of the ledger and the silent shelves. Or he could take it outside, into the fog, where the eyes of the office could not follow. He tucked the packet into his inner pocket, against his waistcoat. It sat there, a hard lump against his ribs, a secret weight that shifted when he breathed. 42 days, he said to the empty corridor. The words hung in the air, a promise and a threat. He turned back to the alcove, but he did not light the candle again. He walked to the window and looked out at Chancery Lane. The fog had thickened, swallowing the street lamps, turning the world into a grey void where nothing was solid and nothing was certain. Somewhere out there, the Thames flowed black and silent, carrying the ash of the truth away to the sea, but not all of it. He picked up his hat. The brim was worn, the leather band cracked from years of use. He placed it on his head, pulling it low over his eyes, and walked to the door. He did not lock it. Let Vane come. Let him find the empty desk and the open ledger. Let him see that the silence had been broken. Thorne stepped into the corridor. The darkness was absolute, but he knew the way. He moved towards the stairs, towards the basement, towards the fire. The packet burned against his side, a coal that would not go out. He would find the ash. He would find the hole, and he would fill it with ink. The stairs descended into the earth like a throat-swallowing light. Thorne's boots found the iron edges by memory, each step releasing a groan of metal that vibrated up through the soles and settled in his knees. Below, the air grew thick, heavy with the scent of coal dust and something sweeter, the acrid perfume of burning cellulose that caught in the back of the nose and lingered on the tongue. He kept one hand on the damp wall, the plaster crumbling under his fingertips like dry biscuit, while the other pressed the oilcloth packet flat against his waistcoat. The lump remained warm, a stubborn heat that refused to cool despite the chill rising from the basement floor. At the landing, the darkness broke. A furnace door stood ajar, spilling a jagged orange glow across the flagged stones. Shadows danced against the brickwork, elongating and twisting until they resembled men hanging from hooks. Thorne halted. The heat hit him first, a physical wave that dried the sweat on his upper lip within seconds. He stepped into the light. A figure hunched before the furnace mouth, feeding long strips of paper into the maw with a pair of iron tongs. The man wore a leather apron stained black with soot, his face obscured by the brim of a low cap. He did not turn as Thorne approached, though the rhythm of his work stuttered, the tongs hovering over the fire before dropping another bundle into the flames. The paper curled instantly, blackening at the edges before collapsing into grey flakes that swirled up the flue. "Vane sent you to watch the Count." The porter's voice was flat, devoid of inflection, as if he had asked the same question a dozen times that night. Thorne moved closer, the heat prickling the skin on his forearms. "I came to see what burns." "Rubbish, old ledgers, spent warrants." The porter jabbed the tongs forward, pushing a stubborn sheet deeper into the inferno. "Paper rots if you keep it, eats the shelves." "Not the Roose indictment." The tongs clattered against the iron rim of the furnace. The porter straightened, turning slowly. His face was smeared with grime, the whites of his eyes stark against the soot. He looked at Thorne, then at the pocket where the oilcloth lay hidden, before returning his gaze to the fire. "You speak of things best left ash. The chief clerk says the archive is full. Something must go for something to come in." "And what comes in, Gudgeon?" Thorne asked. He kept his voice low, matching the hum of the draft pulling smoke up the chimney. "What replaces the dead?" Gudgeon wiped his hands on the apron, leaving streaks of grey on the leather. "Orders, new laws. The world moves on, Mr. Thorne. It does not sit still for grief." He reached for another bundle from the stack beside him, but Thorne stepped forward, blocking the path to the fuel. "That stack, let me see it." "It is going in." "Leave it." Gudgeon hesitated, the tongs hanging loose in his grip. The furnace roared, a sudden gust of wind down the flue making the flames leap high, casting their shadows large against the far wall. For a moment, the light illuminated the corner of the room where sacks of coal stood stacked like coffins. Thorne ignored them. He reached out and took the top sheet from the bundle Gudgeon had intended to burn. The paper was hot, singed at the corner, but the ink remained legible. A seal pressed into the wax, red as fresh blood, bore the mark of the High Court. "You should not touch that," Gudgeon said. He did not move to stop him. "Heat burns, ink stains, some things mark you permanent." Thorne turned the sheet over. The text was a docketing slip, a summary of transfers, dates from September, names of boxes removed from the Chancery Lane shelves. His own handwriting appeared in the margin, a notation made weeks ago before the lockdown began. He traced the loop of his own T, the ink slightly blurred where moisture had touched it. Aris had borrowed his pen once, years ago, before the powder. He remembered the way his brother held the quill, too tight, the knuckles white. "Who authorized this transfer?" Thorne asked. He folded the paper, tucking it inside his waistcoat alongside the packet. The two items pressed together, paper against oilcloth, secrets layering upon secrets. Gudgeon turned back to the furnace. He picked up the tongs again, his shoulders hunched against the heat. "The order bears a signature. I do not read signatures, I feed the fire." He shoved a fresh bundle into the flames. The paper caught instantly, flaring bright before dying down to embers. "You have what you came for. Now go. The heat is bad for the Constitution." Thorne did not move. He watched the flames consume the evidence, the edges of the paper curling like fingers withdrawing from pain. It reminded him of the stories regarding Roose, the cook who claimed the powder was a jest that boiled men alive. The Act of 1531 demanded the punishment fit the crime, a poetic symmetry of liquid fire for liquid poison. Here, in the basement of the record office, the symmetry held, knowledge burned to protect ignorance. Your brother asked about the ash, Gudgeon said suddenly. He did not look up. The tongs rested on the iron grate, vibrating slightly with the draught. He stood where you stand, asked if the ash flew away or settled. Thorne felt the muscles in his neck tighten. What did you tell him? I told him ash is heavy, it sinks. Gudgeon lifted a sack from the floor, loosening the drawstring. Inside, the contents were grey and fine, dusted with fragments of wax and charred vellum. It goes into the river, but some stays in the bag, some stays in the lungs. He kicked the sack towards Thorne's boots. It landed with a soft thud, raising a small cloud of grey dust that hung in the orange light. Thorne looked down at it. The dust settled on the leather of his boots, marking him. He could leave it. He could walk back up the stairs, return to the alcove, and pretend the fire was merely routine maintenance. He could deliver the packet to Vane and claim ignorance of the burn pile. He crouched, the heat from the furnace pressed against his back, uncomfortable and relentless. He dipped his fingers into the sack. The ash was cold on the surface, but warm beneath, retaining the memory of the fire. He sifted through it, feeling for hardness, for wax, for anything that had not fully surrendered to the flame. His thumb caught on a shard. He pulled it free. A piece of seal, red wax, partially melted, but the impression remained. A fish, the symbol of Bishop Fisher. Thorne straightened, holding the fragment between thumb and forefinger. It was small, no larger than a fingernail, but it carried the weight of the entire indictment. If this file was being burned, then Vane was not merely cleaning shelves. He was erasing the connection between the 1531 poisoning and the current office. He was hiding the path Aris had walked. Gudgeon, Thorne said. His voice sounded rough, scraped by the smoke. When the next bundle comes, do not burn it. I have my orders. And I have this. Thorne tapped the wax fragment against his waistcoat pocket. If I walk to Whitehall with this shard, the chief clerk will have more than missing ledgers to explain. He will have interference with a coroner's inquiry. Gudgeon froze. The tongs slipped from his grip, clattering onto the flags. He looked at Thorne, really looked at him, seeing the exhaustion and the grief and the dangerous stillness that had settled over the clerk like a shroud. You cannot stop the fire, Mr. Thorne. It eats everything eventually. Then I shall choke it. Thorne turned towards the stairs. The ascent would be harder than the descent. The heat clung to his clothes, heavy as a wet coat. He pocketed the wax shard, feeling its sharp edges dig into his palm. Keep the sack. I will send a boy for it in the morning. He will not come. Then I will. Thorne placed his foot on the first step. The iron groaned again, a complaint of metal under strain. He paused, looking back at the furnace where the flames continued their mindless work, consuming paper and history alike. And Gudgeon, if you burn the next bundle before I return, I will ensure you are the one who boils. He did not wait for a response. He climbed into the dark, the wax shard pressing into his palm, a tiny hard truth in a world of soft lies. At the top of the stairs, the corridor air felt thin and cold, smelling of dust and old ink. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a second to steady his breathing. The packet against his ribs shifted. The wax in his pocket dug deep. He pushed off the wall and walked towards the alcove, towards the ledger, towards the ink that would record what the fire tried to hide. Smoke clung to the wool of his coat, a grey ghost that refused to be brushed away. Thorne stood in the corridor, letting the cold stone leach the heat from his spine. The gas jets overhead hissed, a sound like insects trapped in glass, casting long shadows that stretched towards the alcove like grasping fingers. He wiped his hands on his trousers, smearing the ash deeper into the fabric. It would show. Vane would see it. Let him. He moved forward. The flagstones felt slippery under his boots, damp with the condensation of the building's own breath. Reaching the partition, he slid behind the stained wood and sank into the chair. The cane seat creaked, a complaint of age and strain. He placed the ledger on the desk. The leather cover was cool, smooth as skin. Inside, the pages waited, blank and judgmental. From his waistcoat, he retrieved the packet. It landed on the wood with a dull thud. Next came the wax shard. He set it beside the inkwell, the red fragment glowing faintly in the yellow light. The fish impression faced up, eyeless and permanent, a symbol of a bishop who survived while his servants boiled. Thorne dipped the pen. The nib scratched against the pot, gathering a heavy load of black fluid. He hovered over the page. What does one write when the truth is contraband? Footsteps approached, light hurried, belonging to someone who feared the sound of their own walking. Thorne did not look up. He began to write, the nib digging into the paper, leaving a trail of permanent record that meant nothing to anyone but him. Mr. Thorne. The voice belonged to Pym, a junior clerk with ink-stained cuffs and a habit of apologizing for breathing. Thorne finished the loop of a capital H before lifting his gaze. Pym stood at the edge of the partition, holding a candlestick that guttered in the draught. The flame threw wild shapes against the shelves of vellum. "Past 9, sir," Pym said. He shifted his weight. The candle wax dripped onto his thumb, and he flinched, but did not wipe it away. Mr. Vane asked if the recataloguing was complete. Mr. Vane asks many questions. Thorne blew on the wet ink. It shimmered, dark and oily. Tell him the vellum is brittle. It requires patience. It smells of burning down here. Pym stepped closer, nose twitching. The candlelight caught the dust motes dancing around his head, a halo of grey snow. The watchman said the furnace was drawing hard. Old paper burns hot. You know the composition, lignin and sulfur. Thorne picked up the wax shard. He rolled it between his thumb and finger, feeling the sharp edge bite into the skin. It leaves a residue, in the air, in the throat. Pym swallowed. The sound was audible in the quiet corridor. He looked at the ledger, then at the packet, then at Thorne's soot-stained cuffs. Curiosity warred with self-preservation behind his eyes. He wanted to know. He wanted to be safe. Both were impossible. Shall I tell him you are finishing? Tell him I am preserving. Thorne dropped the wax into the inkwell. It sank, disappearing beneath the black surface. History is fragile, Pym. It crumbles if handled without care. Sometimes it must be submerged to survive. Pym frowned. The candle flame dipped low, then surged. Submerged, sir. In ink, in record. Thorne closed the ledger. The sound was final, like a coffin lid. Go home, boy, the fog is thickening. It plays tricks on the mind. Pym hesitated. He opened his mouth, perhaps to ask about the smell of smoke again, or the strange hardness in Thorne's voice. He thought better of it. He backed away, the shadows swallowing him whole until only the light of the candle remained, then that too vanished around the corner. Thorne listened to the footsteps fade. Silence returned, heavy and expectant. He opened the ledger again. The wax sat at the bottom of the inkwell, a red secret drowned in black. He dipped the pen once more. This time he wrote a date, 1531, then a name, Roose. He underlined it twice. The paper absorbed the ink, drinking it greedily. It was a violation of the filing system. Vane would spot it immediately. That was the point. Aris had loved puzzles. He had spent hours in the study at home, spreading maps across the table, tracing routes with a finger that smelled of tobacco and arsenic. Thorne remembered the way the light fell across those maps, the dust motes dancing just like they did around Pym. He remembered the powder found on the floor, white, fine, like the ash in the sack downstairs. He pushed the thought away. It clawed at the edges of his mind, demanding attention. Grief was a luxury he could not afford while the fire still burned. He stood up. The chair scraped against the flags, a harsh shriek that echoed down the hall. He tucked the ledger under his arm. It felt heavy, weighted with the lies he had just inscribed. The packet went into his inside pocket. The wax remained in the inkwell, a marker. If Vane touched it, he would stain his fingers red. A warning written in lipid and pigment. Thorne extinguished the gas jet at his station. Darkness rushed in, instant and total. He lit a match. The sulfur flare smelled of the furnace, of the basement, of the past. He cupped the flame against the wind of the corridor and began to walk. He did not head for the exit. The street outside was choked with fog, the cabmen sleeping in their ranks, the horses steaming in the cold. There was no conveyance for where he needed to go. He needed to walk. He needed to feel the pavement under his boots. Lambeth lay across the river. The site of the palace was gone, rebuilt into something modern and clean, but the ground remained. The earth remembered what the buildings forgot. At the porter's lodge, the watchman slept, head resting on a ledger of his own. Thorne slipped past. The heavy oak door groaned as he pushed it open, admitting a slice of the London night. The air outside was cold, wet with the breath of the Thames. It coated his face in a thin film of moisture. He turned towards the bridge. The gas lamps along the road were dim, haloed by the mist, creating islands of light in a sea of grey. His boots struck the cobbles. Click, clack, click, a rhythm to match the beating of his own blood. He thought of the boiling pot. The Act of 1531 specified the method: liquid fire for liquid poison, a symmetry that pleased the lawmakers. He wondered if Roose screamed. The records did not say. They only recorded the sentence, not the sound. Aris had not screamed. He had been found slumped over the desk, quiet as a man sleeping. The powder had done its work without noise. Thorne tightened his grip on the ledger. The leather dug into his palm. He would walk to the riverside. He would stand on the pavement where Alice Trippitt died. He would speak their names into the fog. If the dead could hear, they would know they were not forgotten. If they could not, then the act was for him alone, a ritual to keep the madness at bay. A hansom cab rattled past, the wheels sparking against the stone. The driver looked down, a shadowy figure in the box, but did not stop. Thorne kept walking. The rhythm of his steps changed as he reached the bridge. The wood sounded different than the stone, hollow. He paused at the midpoint. The water below was black, moving slow and thick with the tide. It carried the refuse of the city, the ash from the furnaces, the secrets of the offices along the bank. He leaned over the railing. The wood was cold, damp with rot. He looked down at the water. It looked like ink, deep, impenetrable black. He could drop the ledger, it would sink. The truth would dissolve in the Thames. Vane would never know. The fire would win. Thorne straightened. He pulled the ledger closer. No, the fire had taken enough. It had taken Aris. It had taken Alice and Burnett. It would not take the record. He turned away from the river. The path to Lambeth lay ahead, a dark ribbon unwinding into the fog. He walked faster. The wax in the inkwell waited. The furnace downstairs waited. The dead waited. He would not keep them waiting any longer. Thorne turned from the railing, the ledger pressing against his ribs like a second heart, clumsy and beating too slow. Fog clung to the wool of his coat, dampening the fiber until the garment weighed twice its proper mass, a wet shroud dragging at his shoulders. He moved off the bridge, boots finding the purchase of the Lambeth Road, where the cobbles, slicked with river mud, offered a treacherous grip for any man burdened by secrets. Gas lamps stood at intervals, their yellow eyes dimmed by the vapor, casting pools of light that failed to meet one another, leaving gaps of darkness where a thief might wait or a ghost might form. He walked. The rhythm of his stride was the only clock he trusted now, a steady register acute of distance against the encroaching night. "Hoy, master!" The voice cracked from the shadows near a pile of discarded crates, sharp as a whiplash. Thorne halted, hand instinctively flying to the inside pocket where the leather bound the stolen truth. A figure detached itself from the gloom, a night watchman leaning on a staff, the lantern at his belt swinging lazily to paint the man's face in shifting oranges and blacks. "Past 2 of the clock," the watchman said, stepping into the light. He wore a heavy cape, stained with rain and soot, and his breath plumed white in the cold air. "You're far from Chancery, sir. This ain't a district for gentlemen after dark." "Business does not keep office hours," Thorne replied, his voice sounding thin, stripped of authority by the vast emptiness of the street. "I require the riverside pavement, near the old palace site." The watchman spat, a dark globule landing on the stone with a wet slap. "Palace? There's no palace here, just warehouses and the dead. You seek the waterworks, maybe, or the asylum." "I seek the ground." Thorne tightened his grip on the ledger, the edges dug into his palm, sharp as a knife. "Where the bishop's kitchens stood 300 years ago." The watchman laughed, a dry, rattling sound that echoed off the brickwork of the nearest warehouse. 300 years? You're a odd one, master. Ground don't remember. People forget. That's how we survive. He shifted the lantern, the light catching the metal badge on his chest. "Mind the tide, though. It comes up quick this time of night. Swallows a man whole if he's not watching." "I will watch." "Suit yourself." The watchman turned back to the shadows, merging with the dark as if he were made of it. "Don't say I didn't warn you. The river takes what it wants." Thorne continued, the watchman's words hanging in the air like smoke. "The river takes what it wants." Aris had been taken by powder, not water, but the result was the same. A vacancy where a man once stood, a silence where a voice once spoke. He navigated the turn towards the water's edge, the path narrowing until the wall of the Thames embankment rose on his left, a barrier between the city and the flow. The smell here was stronger, a pungent cocktail of brackish mud, rotting fish, and the sulfur waste from the gasworks upstream, a scent that coated the back of the throat with oily residue. He stopped. This was the place. The records placed Fisher's palace here, the kitchens overlooking the water where the servants had supped before the pain began. Nothing remained of the structure save the foundations buried beneath the modern brick, yet the air felt different, heavier, as if the atmosphere itself retained the memory of the heat. Thorne closed his eyes, letting the sensory input of 1862 fade until the roar of the traffic diminished to the lap of water against wood. In his mind, the fog cleared. He saw the kitchen, vast and shadowed, lit by the roar of a fire large enough to roast an ox. A pot hung over the flames, iron blackened by years of use, the contents bubbling with a violent, thick rhythm. Porridge, oatmeal, white powder stirred into the grey sludge. Alice Trippitt lifting the spoon, Bernard Cowan chewing. The heat rising not from the fire but from within the gut, a liquid fire that cooked the organs while the skin remained intact. Thorne gasped, eyes snapping open. The modern street rushed back, the gas lamps flickering, the cold dampness of the fog returning to his skin. He leaned against the wall, the brick rough against his cheek, grounding him in the present. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, visible in the lamplight. The ledger felt hotter now, radiating a warmth that seeped through the wool of his coat. "You lied," he whispered to the wall. "The record says willful murder, but a mistake tastes the same." The wind picked up, rushing down the river with a low moan that sounded suspiciously like a human voice crying out in agony. It whipped the fog into swirls, obscuring the path ahead, turning the familiar cobbles into a landscape of uncertainty. Thorne pushed off the wall, forcing his legs to move, to carry him further along the bank, where the tide lapped against the stone steps. The water was high, black and oily, reflecting the distorted shapes of the warehouses like a broken mirror. He reached a set of stairs leading down to the water's edge, the stone worn smooth by centuries of boots and tides. He descended, the sound of the water growing louder, a rhythmic slapping against the stone that matched the beating of his own blood. At the bottom, the mud sucked at his boots, threatening to hold him fast, to pull him down into the dark sediment where the refuse of the city settled. Thorne stood at the water's edge, the ledger clutched to his chest. He looked out at the Thames, the black water moving inexorably towards the sea, carrying with it the secrets of every bridge it passed under. He thought of the boiling act, the symmetry of the punishment, the liquid fire for the liquid poison. Henry VII had demanded a spectacle, a theatre of cruelty to warn others, but the warning had faded while the cruelty remained embedded in the vellum. "Roose," Thorne said, the name barely audible over the water. "Did you know, or were you just a cook who stirred the pot?" The water did not answer. It merely rose, creeping up the steps, inching closer to his boots. The cold seeped through the leather, numbing his toes, a warning that the tide was indeed turning, just as the watchman had said. He needed to leave before the water cut off his return, before the fog swallowed the path back to the road. Thorne turned to climb the stairs, but a sound stopped him. Not the water, not the wind. A scraping noise, like metal on stone, coming from the shadows beneath the warehouse archway nearby. He froze, hand going to his pocket where the matchbox rested. The scraping came again, deliberate, rhythmic. Someone was there, waiting. He stepped back, the mud sucking at his heels, and struck a match. The sulfur flare ignited, casting a brief, harsh light into the darkness beneath the arch. The flame flickered, threatened by the damp, but held long enough to reveal a figure standing in the shadows, holding something long and metallic that glinted in the sudden light. "Who goes there?" Thorne demanded, his voice steadier than he felt. The figure did not speak. It stepped forward into the edge of the light, and Thorne saw the glint of a badge, not unlike the watchman's, but darker, older. The figure raised the metal object, not in threat, but in offering. A key, rusty iron, large enough for a cellar door. "Vane sent you," Thorne said, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. The figure shook its head, slow and deliberate. "Vane sleeps," the man said, his voice rough, unused. "I keep the fire." He tossed the key. It arced through the air, catching the light of the dying match, and landed at Thorne's feet with a heavy clatter on the stone. The match burned down to Thorne's fingers, the heat biting into his skin, forcing him to drop it into the mud where it hissed and died. Darkness returned, total and absolute, save for the faint glow of the key lying in the sludge. Thorne looked down, then back up, but the figure was gone, vanished into the fog as if it had never been. He bent, fingers trembling, and retrieved the key. It was cold, heavy, and smelled of old iron and ash. He pocketed it, the metal pressing against his hip alongside the ledger. The tide lapped at his boots again, higher this time. He climbed the stairs, two at a time, desperate to reach the solid ground of the road before the water claimed the steps. Behind him, the scraping sound resumed, louder now, as if something heavy was being dragged across the stone. He did not look back. He walked fast, towards the gas lamps, towards the road, towards the safety of the living city, but the key in his pocket felt like a brand, marking him as belonging to the fire, to the past, to the boiling pot that waited in the dark. The scraping did not cease. It multiplied, a wet drag of iron against wet stone that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere within the archway's throat. Thorne climbed, his boots slipping on the slick moss coating the upper steps, the key in his pocket heavy as a lead weight pulling at his trouser leg. He reached the pavement of the road just as the fog rolled thicker, sealing the river behind a wall of grey wool that smelled of coal smoke and rotting kelp. "Stop," a voice said, not from the shadows below, but from the street lamp directly ahead. Thorne halted, his breath hitching in a ragged gasp that tasted of sulfur. A man stood beneath the gas jet, the light carving deep hollows into his cheeks, his coat collar turned up against the damp. He held no weapon, only a lantern with the shutter closed, casting a thin blade of illumination across the cobbles. "You run like a guilty man, Clark," the stranger said, stepping forward until the light caught the silver watch chain draped across his waistcoat. "Yet you carry nothing but a book and a rusted thing in your pocket." "I carry my life," Thorne snapped, his hand instinctively guarding the pocket where the key burned cold against his thigh. "And I owe you no explanation." "Everyone owes the crown an explanation," the man replied, his tone flat, devoid of the bureaucratic cheer Silas Vane affected. "Especially those who walk the banks at tide turn, speaking to ghosts named Roose." Thorne flinched, the name striking him with the precision of a physical blow. He took a step back, his heel catching on a loose stone, but he recovered his balance before he could stumble. The fog muffled the sound of passing carriages, isolating them in a pocket of silence that felt pressurized, ready to burst. "Who are you?" Thorne demanded, his voice cracking slightly on the final syllable. "A keeper of accounts," the man said, opening the lantern shutter just enough to let a sliver of light fall on Thorne's face. "Like you, though I count the living, and you seem determined to tally the dead." He moved closer, the smell of stale tobacco and peppermint rolling off him, a sharp contrast to the river stench clinging to Thorne's clothes. The man's eyes were pale, almost colorless in the gaslight, fixed on Thorne with an intensity that suggested he saw more than just a wet clerk on a London street. "Vane knows you took the role," the man said, not a question, but a statement of fact delivered with the casual ease of commenting on the weather. "He knows you walked to Lambeth. He knows you stand by the water speaking names that have not been uttered aloud in 3 centuries. "Vane knows nothing but the weight of dust," Thorne retorted, stiffening his spine against the chill that seeped through his damp wool. "He catalogues death. I seek the cause of it." "The cause is law," the man said, snapping the lantern shutter closed with a sharp click that echoed like a pistol shot. "Henry VIII wrote it in ink, and you cannot erase it with your grief, Mr. Thorne. Your brother Aris learned that lesson too late, did he not?" Thorne froze, the air vanishing from his lungs as if the man had reached inside his chest and squeezed. The mention of Aris here, on this fog-choked street, felt like a violation of a sacred tomb, a profanity spoken in a church of silence. He gripped the ledger under his arm, his knuckles white, the leather cover digging into his ribs. "Do not speak his name," Thorne whispered, the words tearing from his throat. "You have no right." "I have every right," the man countered, his voice dropping to a murmur that forced Thorne to lean in to hear him. "Because I was there when the powder fell. I was there when the cup was lifted. I am the only one left who remembers the taste of the porridge, Mr. Thorne, and I am telling you that the boil is not finished." He reached out, his fingers brushing the lapel of Thorne's coat, leaving a smear of grease on the dark fabric. The touch was intimate, terrifying, a connection that bridged the gap between 1862 and 1531 with a sudden, jarring clarity. "The key you hold opens the cellar beneath the old kitchen," the man said, stepping back into the shadows where the gaslight could not reach. "Go there, before Vane sends the constables to arrest you for theft, before the fog lifts and reveals you to the world as a madman talking to the river." "Wait," Thorne called out, lunging forward into the gloom. "Who are you? What do you want?" "I want the truth to be recorded," the voice floated back, disembodied now, drifting away from the lamp post. "Not in the margins of an indictment, but in the flesh of the living. Go to the cellar, Thorne. The pot is still warm." Thorne stood alone under the flickering gas jet, the street empty save for the swirling mist that obscured the end of the road. He pressed his hand against his pocket, feeling the jagged teeth of the key through the fabric, its presence undeniable and heavy. The scraping sound from the riverbank had ceased, replaced by the distant, rhythmic tolling of a bell from a church tower hidden in the fog, marking the hour with a somber, iron clangor. He turned away from the river, away from the place where the figure had vanished, and began to walk inland, towards Chancery Lane and the record office that now felt like a prison waiting to lock its doors. The cobblestones seemed to shift beneath his feet, uneven and treacherous, as if the ground itself remembered the weight of the boiling act and sought to replicate the turbulence of the liquid fire. He clutched the ledger tighter, the edges of the vellum pages pressing against his palm, a tangible link to the dead men and women whose names he had traced in the dim light of his alcove. A carriage rumbled past, the wheels splashing through a puddle of dirty water that sprayed up onto the pavement, soaking the hem of his trousers. Thorne did not flinch, did not brush the stain away. He walked with a singular purpose, the key burning a hole in his pocket, the man's words echoing in his mind with the persistence of a fever dream. The cellar beneath the old kitchen, the pot still warm. It was impossible, absurd, yet the certainty in the stranger's voice had shaken the foundations of his skepticism, leaving him adrift in a sea of doubt, where history and hallucination merged into a single, terrifying reality. He reached the corner of the street, paused to look back, but saw only the fog, thick and impenetrable, hiding the river and the man and the key's origin. There was no one there, no one but him and the ghosts he carried in his head. He turned the corner and walked faster, the sound of his own footsteps echoing off the brick walls, a lonely rhythm in the empty night that matched the beating of his heart, urgent and afraid. The record office loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the lighter gray of the sky, its windows dark and blind, watching him approach with the silent judgment of 1,000 years of stored secrets. He would not go inside. Not yet. The key demanded a different destination, a descent into the earth where the heat of 1531 might still linger in the stones. Thorne adjusted his grip on the ledger, squared his shoulders against the damp air, and set his face towards Lambeth, towards the river, towards the cellar that waited in the dark. The turn back towards Lambeth felt less like a decision and more like a physical yank, a hook set deep in the navel dragging him away from the safety of Chancery Lane. Mud sucked at his boots. He did not care. The ledger under his arm slipped, leather slick with the damp, and he clamped it tighter against his side, ribs protesting the pressure. A fog bank rolled off the Thames, thick as wool, swallowing the gas jets one by one until the street became a tunnel of grey nothingness where sound travelled wrong, distorted and close. Somewhere a dog barked, sharp and sudden, then cut off as if a hand had clamped over its muzzle. Thorne walked faster. The key in his pocket knocked against his thigh with every stride, a metallic rhythm marking time, tick, 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 counting down to something he could not name but feared nonetheless. He reached the perimeter of the bishop's former grounds, now a jumble of new brick and old foundation stones half buried in the dirt of a construction site. A hoarding of rough timber blocked the view, painted with advertisements for soap and tonics that peeled in the moisture, revealing the raw wood beneath. Thorne ran a hand along the planks, feeling the grain, the splinters catching on his glove. There, a gap near the bottom, wide enough for a man to crawl through if he did not mind the mud. He dropped to his knees, the wet earth soaking instantly through the wool of his trousers, cold biting into his bones. He shoved the ledger ahead of him, then dragged his own body after, scraping his coat against the rough timber, tearing a thread from the cuff. He did not stop to mend it. Inside the hoarding, the air changed. It grew heavier, stagnant, smelling of wet ash and something else, something sweet and cloying like meat left too long in a warm pantry. The ground sloped downward, leading towards a recess in the foundation where the shadows pooled thickest. Thorne struck a match, the flare of sulfur bright and harsh in the gloom, illuminating a set of stone steps disappearing into the dark. They were narrow, worn smooth by centuries of feet, each tread dipped in the center where generations of servants had carried heavy loads up to the kitchen above. He descended. The light from the match flickered, dancing on the damp walls, casting long, stretching shadows that seemed to reach for his ankles. One step, two. The smell intensified, rot mixed with the sharp tang of old iron, the scent of a place where blood had once been spilled and never fully washed away. At the bottom, a heavy oak door stood slightly ajar, the wood swollen with damp, blackened by age. Thorne pushed it open. The hinges groaned, a low, complaining sound that echoed loudly in the confined space. He stepped into the cellar. It was vast, arched ceiling lost in the darkness above, supported by thick pillars of stone that sweated condensation. He held the match higher, the flame dwindling, burning his fingers now, but he refused to drop it until he saw what lay in the center of the room. There, amidst the rubble and debris, sat a cauldron. It was massive, iron, rusted through in patches, yet somehow intact, resting on a bed of cold ash that looked disturbingly fresh. He approached it, boots crunching on broken pottery shards scattered across the floor. The silence here was absolute, a physical weight pressing against his eardrums, suffocating. He stopped beside the pot. Inside, nothing but darkness, a void deeper than the shadow of the room itself. He leaned closer, straining to see the bottom, but the gloom swallowed his gaze. Then a sound, a faint bubbling, liquid shifting, a gentle glug-glug rising from the depths. Impossible, the ash was cold. No fire burned beneath, yet the sound persisted, rhythmic and steady, like a heartbeat slowed to a crawl. Thorne recoiled, stumbling back a step, his heel catching on a loose stone. He flailed, arms windmilling, before catching his balance against the rough stone of a pillar. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, fogging in the chill air. He stared at the pot, eyes wide, waiting for the illusion to break, for the rational mind to reassert its control over the terrified animal brain screaming at him to run. It did not break. The bubbling grew louder, more insistent, accompanied now by a faint hiss, like steam escaping a crack. A smell wafted up, acrid and hot, smelling of boiled pork and something herbal, bitter, the scent of the gruel that had killed Alice Trippitt and Bernard Curwen 300 years ago. Thorne gagged, covering his mouth with a trembling hand. He wanted to flee, to scramble back up the stairs and out into the clean, cold fog of the street, but his feet refused to move, rooted to the spot by a morbid fascination he could not suppress. He reached into his pocket, fingers closing around the key the stranger had spoken of. It was warm, unnaturally so, heating up against his palm until it felt like a live coal. He pulled it out. The brass gleamed in the dying light of the match, which he finally dropped, letting it fall to the floor where it sputtered and died, plunging him into near-total darkness. Only a faint, grey luminescence seemed to emanate from the pot itself, a sickly greenish glow that illuminated the rusted iron and the swirling liquid within. Thorne stepped forward again, drawn by an invisible tether. He extended the key towards the lock set into the side of the cauldron, a feature he had not noticed before, a small, intricate mechanism buried in the rust. His hand shook. The metal of the key hovered inches from the keyhole. "It is not a mistake," he whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking. "You know it was not a mistake." The bubbling stopped. Instantly, the silence rushed back in, deafening. Then, a voice, not from the shadows, but from the pot itself, low and gurgling as if spoken through water. "No mistake, sealers, only hunger." Thorne jerked his hand back as if strung. The key clattered to the stone floor, the sound ringing out like a bell. He stared at the cauldron, heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. The green glow intensified, pulsing now, rhythmic, matching the beat of his own terrified heart. Shadows detached themselves from the pillars, taking shape, forming figures that stood around the pot, silent observers in tattered livery, their faces obscured by hoods of deep shadow. One figure stepped forward, reaching out a hand towards the lid of the cauldron. "Do not," Thorne said, the command weak, futile. The figure ignored him. The hand, pale and translucent, grasped the iron ring of the lid. Metal shrieked against metal, a sound of tearing flesh as the lid began to lift. Steam billowed out, thick and white, carrying the smell of boiling meat and bitter herbs, filling the cellar, choking the air. Thorne coughed, waving his hand in front of his face, tears streaming from his eyes. Through the haze, he saw something white floating in the dark liquid, something that looked horribly like a human hand. He turned to run, but the figures blocked the path to the stairs, a wall of silent, watching ghosts. He was trapped. The lid lifted higher. The smell became unbearable, a physical assault on the senses. Thorne fell to his knees, retching, his body rejecting the air itself. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying for the vision to end, for the ground to open and swallow him whole rather than force him to witness the recreation of a horror fixed in law and history. "Look," the voice from the pot commanded, louder now, imperative. "See what the king's justice buys." Thorne opened his eyes. He had no choice. The lid was fully raised now, and the contents of the pot were visible, churning and boiling with a violence that defied the cold air of the cellar. And there, amidst the froth, rose a face, distorted by heat and death, eyes wide and unseeing, mouth open in a silent scream that echoed in Thorne's mind. It was not Richard Roose. It was Aris. His brother's face, pale and bloated, rising from the porridge that should have been harmless, now the instrument of a state-sanctioned murder. "Aris," Thorne choked out, reaching towards the pot, forgetting the heat, forgetting the impossibility. "I am here, I am trying to fix it." The face in the pot turned towards him, the eyes focusing with a terrifying clarity. "Too late, Silas," Aris's voice said, coming from the boiling liquid. "The law does not care for truth, it only cares for the boil." The figures around the pot began to chant, a low, rhythmic drone that vibrated in Thorne's teeth, shaking his very skull. The liquid in the cauldron surged, spilling over the sides, hot and thick, flowing towards him across the stone floor. Thorne scrambled backward, slipping on the wet stones, falling hard onto his back. The liquid advanced, relentless, steaming, smelling of death and injustice. He clawed at the ground, fingernails breaking against the rough stone, trying to find purchase, trying to escape the rising tide of history that demanded its due. Above him, the arched ceiling seemed to lower, the shadows deepening, closing in. The key lay nearby, glowing still, useless now. The ledger lay forgotten by the stairs, its pages fluttering in a wind that did not exist. Thorne stopped struggling. He lay back, watching the steam rise, watching the face of his brother sink back into the froth. There was no escape from this. The past was not dead. It was not even past. It was here in this cellar, in this pot, waiting for him to join the boil. He closed his eyes as the heat reached his boots, leather shrinking, skin blistering. The chanting grew louder, drowning out his own screams, drowning out the truth he had sought to find. The last thing he heard was the splash of the liquid as it claimed him, and the satisfied sigh of the law fulfilled once more. Heat did not touch him, not yet. The blistering pain in his boots remained a phantom, a trick of the mind weaving itself around the nerves like ivy on a ruin. Thorne snapped his eyes open. The cellar rushed back, solid and indifferent, smelling only of damp limestone, rat droppings, and the stale, sulphurous reek of the gas main overhead. No steam, no chanting. The cauldron sat cold and rusted in the center of the room, a dormant beast of iron that had never known fire. He lay sprawled on the flagstones, cheek pressed against the grit, lungs heaving as if he had run from Chancery Lane to the river without stopping. His fingers, still curled into claws, scraped uselessly at the stone. Nothing flowed towards him but a thin trickle of condensation from the wall, cold enough to soak the cuff of his coat. "Get up," he whispered. The words tasted of copper and old dust. He pushed himself upright, joints cracking in the silence. The matchbox lay where he had dropped it, the brass key nestled beside it, dull and lifeless under the single, flickering jet of gas that sputtered near the stairs. There were no figures in tattered livery, no Aris rising from the froth, just the shadows cast by the iron shelves, long and distorted, stretching across the floor like accusing fingers. Thorne stumbled to his feet, brushing the grit from his trousers. His hands shook so violently he could not button his waistcoat. He looked at the cauldron again, expecting the lid to rattle, for the voice to surge up from the dark water inside, but the pot remained silent. It was just a pot, an artifact of a barbarous age, stored away because the government did not know what else to do with it. The law does not care for truth. The echo lingered, not in the air, but in the marrow of his bones. He walked to the cauldron, drawn by a morbid need to verify its emptiness. He reached out, his hand hovering over the rusted rim. Cold air radiated from the iron. He leaned closer, peering into the gloom within, dry, dusty. A few dead flies floated on the bottom, legs curled, preserved in their own stillness. "No porridge," he said aloud, testing the reality of his own voice. "No broth." He straightened, turning his back on the thing. The ledger lay by the stairs, pages ruffled by a draft that did not exist. He walked over, picked it up, and brushed the dirt from the cover. The leather felt greasy under his palm. He opened it to the page he had been annotating before the vision took hold. The ink of his own handwriting stared back, the word "why" scrawled in the margin, bold and accusatory, against the faded script of the 1531 indictment. Aris was dead, that was the truth, not boiling in a pot in Lambeth, not rising from a gruel of arsenic and oats. Aris was in the ground at Highgate, 6 feet under, wrapped in a shroud that had likely rotted away by now. The arsenic had done its work quietly, internally, without the theatre of a cauldron or the audience of a king's executioner. There had been no boiling for his brother. Only the slow, quiet shutting down of organs, the delirium, the final stillness. Thorne traced the line of the indictment with his thumb. Richard Roose. The name seemed to pulse under his touch. A cook, a servant, a man who claimed it was a jest, a mistake, a confusion of powders. And for that mistake, the Parliament of England had devised a punishment so specific, so gruesome, that it haunted the corridors of justice 3 centuries later. "He did not mean to kill them," Thorne murmured, the deflection automatic, a shield he had raised 1,000 times for himself. It was an error, a tragic error. But the vision in the cellar had stripped that defense bare. The law did not distinguish between malice and mistake when the result was death. Henry VII had seen to that. The act was clear. Poison was a threat to the state, a weapon of the subtle and the cowardly, and it required a response that would sear the memory of the populace. Boiling alive, not hanging, not beheading, boiling. Thorne closed the ledger with a snap that echoed too loudly in the confined space. He needed to leave. The air down here was thick, pressing against his eardrums, making his head swim. He grabbed the matchbox and the key, shoving them into his pocket. The brass burned against his thigh, a sharp, grounding weight. He climbed the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, desperate for the street, for the noise of carriages, for the smell of coal smoke and horse manure that signaled the living world. He burst out into the alleyway behind the record office, gasping as the cool autumn air hit his face. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the jagged silhouette of the rooftops against a bruised purple sky. Lanterns glowed in the windows of the clerks' houses, across the lane warm squares of yellow light that promised safety and domesticity. Thorne leaned against the brickwork, sliding down until he sat on the damp pavement. His breath plumed before him, white and transient. He watched a stray dog pick its way through the rubbish heap at the end of the alley, sniffing at a discarded fish head. The animal tore at the flesh, growling low in its throat, possessive and primal. "It only cares for the boil," Thorne said to the dog. The animal ignored him, dragging its prize into the shadows. Thorne pulled the key from his pocket again. In the dim light of the street lamp, he saw something he had missed in the cellar. Etched into the brass, almost worn away by time, was a small mark, a symbol, not a maker's mark, but a deliberate engraving. A tiny, stylized pot with a single figure standing beside it. He rubbed his thumb over the image. The metal was smooth, polished by years of handling. Who had held this key before him? The jailer at Smithfield, the clerk who logged the evidence, or someone else, someone who had also tried to unlock the secrets of the Roose case and found only ghosts. A window opened above him. A woman's voice, sharp with irritation, cut through the quiet. "Keep it down out there. Some of us are trying to sleep." Thorne looked up. A face appeared in the window, framed by curtains, obscured by the glare of the candle behind it. He could not see the features, only the shape of a head, the suggestion of a hand pulling the sash down. "Sorry," he called back, his voice rough. "Just leaving." The window slammed shut. The latch clicked. Silence returned, heavier than before. Thorne pushed himself to his feet. His legs felt weak, unstable, as if the ground beneath him was still shifting. He tucked the key deep into his pocket, ensuring it was secure. He had the document. He had the key. And he had the certainty that the story of Richard Roose was not finished, not while men like him continued to dig in the dirt of the past, looking for reasons where there were only causes. He began to walk, moving away from the record office, away from Chancery Lane. The streets were emptying now, the workers heading home, the shops closing their shutters. The city was preparing for the night, sealing itself against the dark. Thorne walked with his collar turned up, the wind biting at his exposed neck. He thought of the letter in his desk drawer, the one addressed to Aris. He had written it 3 days ago, pouring out his grief, his guilt, his theories about the poison. He had never posted it. How could he? Aris was dead. The post office could not deliver words to the grave. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the writing was not for the recipient, but for the writer, a way to exorcise the ghosts before they took root in the cellar of the mind. He turned the corner onto Fleet Street. A hansom cab clattered past, the driver shouting at a pedestrian who lingered too long in the road. The wheels sparked against the cobblestones, a brief flash of fire in the gloom. Thorne watched it go, the red tail light fading into the fog. He would go home, he would make tea, he would sit by the fire and read the indictment again, line by line, until the words lost their meaning and became just marks on paper. But first, he needed to stop at the churchyard. He needed to tell Aris what he had seen, not the vision of the boiling pot, but the truth of the law, that it was hungry, that it was always hungry. And he needed to ask, one last time, if it was worth the price. The fog rolled in again, thicker now, wrapping around his legs, obscuring the path ahead. Thorne walked into it, a solitary figure in a city of millions, carrying the weight of the dead in his pocket. Behind him, the record office loomed, a silent sentinel guarding its secrets, waiting for the next clerk to come and stir the pot. The Porridge Boil is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Poisons and poisoners, with historical accounts of some famous mysteries in ancient and modern times. Internet Archive. Richard Roose. List of nicknames of serial killers. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.